My name is Elias Thorne. I am a park ranger, specializing in resource management for the National Park Service, a position I have held for the better part of 2 decades. My official duties are varied, encompassing backcountry patrols, ecological surveys, and the inventory and protection of the natural and historical features contained within the vast tracts of wilderness entrusted to our care. It is a role I consider less a job and more a stewardship, a commitment to the profound, silent majesty of these ancient mountains. Many of my colleagues prefer the more populated park areas, the visitor centers and scenic drives where they can engage with the public. I am not one of them. My temperament is better suited to the deep solitude of the backcountry, to the long weeks spent alone in remote mountain posts where the only voices are the wind in the hemlocks and the rush of a cold stream. This preference for isolation is not misanthropy. It is a professional asset, a prerequisite for the kind of work that requires immense patience and a deep, abiding comfort with one's own company. There is a psychological resilience demanded by this life, a quiet strength that I have cultivated over many years of walking these trails alone, a reality echoed in the memoirs of rangers who have come before me. My current assignment was the culmination of this career path, a multi-week solo expedition into a rarely patrolled sector of the Great Smoky Mountains National Park. This area, a labyrinth of steep gorges and high ridges, was once the heart of the Little River Lumber Company's aggressive logging operations in the early 20th century. Between 1901 and 1939, they carved through this wilderness, leaving scars that are only now beginning to heal. The land was absorbed into the park in the 1930s, but its remoteness has left it largely untouched by modern park infrastructure. My mission was twofold: to document the state of forest regeneration and to identify and catalog any remaining unmapped structures from the logging era. These relics, old cabins, forgotten equipment, decaying bridges, needed to be assessed as neither potential hazards to be removed or historical artifacts to be preserved. The first few days of the trek were arduous but familiar. I pushed deep into the park's green heart, following the faint indentations of old logging railroad grades, now little more than shallow ditches in the forest floor, almost entirely reclaimed by a century of leaf, fall, and root growth. The air was thick with the smell of damp earth and decaying wood. This was the Appalachian forest in its full, overwhelming glory, one of the most biologically diverse temperate regions on the planet. The landscape was a constant series of long, broad ridges, steep slopes, deep gorges, and wide intermountain valleys. A topography that has fostered an incredible array of life over millennia of geologic stability. The dominant canopy was a mix of oak, hickory, and ancient stands of eastern hemlock that had, by some miracle, escaped the logger's saw. The understory was a riot of endemic flora, a living museum of rare species: the delicate, drooping heads of American lily, of valley, the ghostly white of trailing monkshood, and the waxy leaves of galax carpeting the ground in dense colonies. Navigating this terrain was a constant battle. The old rail beds often disappeared into what the old timers called rhododendron hells. These were not the manicured shrubs of suburban gardens, but monstrous thickets of rhododendron maximum, some reaching heights of 20 feet or more. Their branches, thick as a man's arm, twisted together into an impenetrable lattice that blocked out the sun and deadened all sound. To get through them, I often had to abandon walking and resort to crawling on my hands and knees, my pack snagging on the gnarled wood. The world reduced to a claustrophobic, green-tinged twilight. It was in these hells that you could truly appreciate the wildness of this place. The feeling that you were an intruder in a world that had its own ancient, implacable rules. On the 5th day, after forcing my way through a particularly nasty slick that left my arms and face crisscrossed with scratches, I emerged onto the lip of a gorge wider and deeper than any I had yet encountered, and spanning it was a skeletal apparition that made me stop dead in my tracks. It was a bridge, a massive wooden railroad trestle, stretching at least 200 feet across the chasm, its dark form a stark, geometric scar against the verdant wilderness. It was not on any of my maps, modern or historical. Using my binoculars, I surveyed its construction with a ranger's eye for detail and decay. It was a classic timber trestle, a series of rigid A-frame supports called bents, marching across the gorge, each one a complex latticework of heavy posts and diagonal sway braces. The timbers were enormous, likely old growth oak or Douglas fir, hewn from the very giants that once stood on these slopes. They were blackened to the color of charcoal, preserved by a century of saturation with creosote. Even from a distance, I could almost smell the acrid, chemical tang of it, a scent that never truly leaves the wood. Heavy iron bolts and plates clamped the joints together, rusted but still holding fast. It was a monument to a brutal kind of ingenuity, built not for elegance, but to bear the crushing weight of the geared shay locomotives that once hauled fortunes in timber out of these mountains. The structure was a place of inherent conflict, a violent line of industrial ambition drawn across a landscape that measured time in millennia. It felt wrong, an unhealed wound. I made my way down to the approach. The ground here was soft and damp, a thick carpet of moss growing over the compacted earth where the tracks once lay. And that's when I saw them. Footprints. A single set, leading onto the bridge. The tread pattern was modern, a Vibram sole or something similar, pressed clearly into the moss. My first thought was of a lost hiker, a Turon, who had wandered dangerously off trail. Though how they could have gotten this deep into a closed sector was a mystery in itself. I followed the prints with my eyes. They proceeded in a steady, confident line of steps out onto the wooden decking of the bridge. They passed the first bent, the second, the third. They continued toward the very center of the span, a point suspended more than 100 feet above the rock-strewn creek below. And then they stopped. I don't mean they scuffed, or turned, or stumbled. They simply ceased to exist. One moment there was a clear print of a right boot, the next, nothing but the weathered, gray wood of the bridge deck. It was as if the person who made them had been lifted straight up into the sky, vanishing without a trace. I stood there for a long time, the silence of the gorge pressing in on me. I scanned the chasm below, my heart beginning to beat a little faster. There was no body, no splash of color from a backpack or jacket, no broken branches on the steep, wooded slopes to mark a fall. The railings of the bridge, from what I could see, were weathered but intact. I looked back and forth along the decking. There was no second set of prints, no return journey. It was a physical impossibility. A scene without a story. A line drawn in the dirt that led directly to nowhere. And as a cold, knot of unease tightened in my stomach, I had the distinct and unwelcome feeling that I had just stumbled upon a place where the normal rules of the world had been suspended. My training kicked in, overriding the primal alarm bells ringing in the back of my mind. A park ranger is, above all, a pragmatist. We are trained to observe, document, and analyze before we conclude. There had to be a logical explanation. A fall was the most obvious, despite the lack of evidence. I unslung my pack and took out my high-powered binoculars, scanning the gorge below with methodical precision. I traced the line from the last footprint down to the creek bed, 100 feet of empty air. Nothing. No snagged clothing on the rhododendron-choked slopes. No unnatural depression in the leaf litter. No splash of color from a discarded pack. The creek, shallow and clear, flowed over a bed of smooth, gray stones. There was no body. I turned my attention back to the bridge itself. Perhaps the person had climbed over the railing and shimmied along the outside of the structure, though to what end I couldn't imagine. I zoomed in on the massive creosote-soaked timbers of the bents. The wood was ancient and weathered, but the iron bolts holding the sway braces and posts together seemed solid, their rust a mere surface stain. There were no fresh scrape marks, no broken splinters, nothing to indicate a recent climb. The railings, simple thick beams, running the length of the span, were intact. There were no reports of missing persons in this sector. But this area was so remote. It could be weeks or months before anyone was noticed missing. I took out my camera and began documenting the scene. Just as procedure dictated, wide shots of the bridge and gorge, then detailed shots of the footprints, each one a perfect, muddy testament leading to its own negation. The professional in me was satisfied. I had my report, my evidence. I could turn back now, hike the 5 days to my station, and file a report that would baffle my superiors and likely get filed away as an unsolved anomaly. But the man in me, the one who had spent 20 years learning the rhythms and secrets of these mountains, couldn't let it go. It felt like a personal challenge, a riddle posed by the wilderness itself. The silence of the gorge was no longer peaceful. It was expectant. It was waiting for my next move. My decision was made before I was even fully conscious of it. I had to cross. Or at least, I had to walk to the point where the footprints vanished. I checked my pack, securing every strap and buckle. The thought of my own gear snagging on some rotten piece of wood was a persistent worry. I took a deep breath. The air tasting of damp, moss, and that faint, chemical tang of the creosote, and stepped onto the bridge. The timbers beneath my boots were solid, far more so than I'd expected. The railroad ties were spaced about a foot apart, with a decking of thick planks laid over them. The wood was silvered with age, but the preservative treatment had done its job, warding off a century of rot. Still, each step was a conscious, deliberate act. I kept my eyes fixed on the structure, testing my weight on each plank before committing. The gorge fell away on either side, a dizzying drop that I forced myself to ignore. The only sounds were the soft tread of my boots and the faint, rhythmic creak of the old wood, a sound like a deep, slow sigh. I followed the footprints. Left, right, left, right. A steady, even gait. Whoever this person was, they hadn't been hesitant. They had walked with a purpose. I passed the first massive A, frame bent, then the second. The wind picked up, whistling through the complex lattice of the trestle supports, creating a low, mournful hum. It was a lonely, desolate sound that seemed to amplify the profound isolation of the place. I was a single, small figure suspended between two sides of an ancient ravine, on a structure that had no business still being here. As I approached the center of the bridge, the point where the final right footprint was pressed into a patch of dried moss, a strange sensation began to creep over me. It started with the sound. The wind didn't die down, but the noise it made seemed to change, the humming deepening into a low frequency, thrum that I felt more in my bones than heard with my ears. It was like standing too close to a massive, unseen engine. My ears popped, as if from a sudden change in pressure. Then my vision began to swim. The air directly ahead of me, right over the spot where the trail ended, seemed to shimmer, like heat haze on a summer road. But the air was cold, carrying the chill of the deep shade and the running water below. The edges of the bridge, the distant trees, the very texture of the wood under my feet. It all seemed to momentarily lose its focus, wavering as if I were looking at a reflection in disturbed water. I stopped, planting my feet, shaking my head to clear it. I blamed it on vertigo, a trick of the height, and the hypnotic pattern of the railroad ties. I took one more step, bringing me to the edge of the last footprint. The thrumming intensified, and a wave of intense, unnatural cold washed over me. It was a deep, penetrating chill that had nothing to do with the ambient temperature. My breath plumed in front of my face. Goosebumps erupted on my arms. The shimmering in the air grew more pronounced, and for a terrifying second, the world through that distortion seemed different. The colors of the forest on the far side of the gorge were subtly wrong. The greens too vibrant, the shadows too deep. It was as if I were looking through a flawed piece of glass into another world, one that was an imperfect copy of our own. A feeling of profound and irrational dread seized me. It was a primal fear, the kind an animal feels when it senses a predator it cannot see. My ingrained comfort with solitude evaporated, replaced by the crushing certainty that I was not alone. There was a presence here, something ancient and vast and utterly indifferent to me. It wasn't malicious, not in a way I could understand. It was simply other. I felt a strange, disorienting sense of temporal displacement, as if I were a single note held too long. A moment stretched into an eternity. The thought, nonsensical and terrifying, flashed through my mind. This place eats time. I backed away. Slowly, deliberately, one step at a time, my eyes locked on the shimmering patch of air. I didn't turn my back on it until my feet were firmly on the mossy ground of the gorge's edge. I stumbled back several yards and leaned against a hemlock, my heart hammering against my ribs. I was breathing heavily, my body trembling from the cold and the adrenaline. I checked my instruments. My compass needle spun uselessly for a moment before settling on north. My GPS was searching for a signal, which wasn't unusual in these deep gorges, but it felt ominous now. I looked at the photos on my digital camera. The footprints were there, clear and sharp, but the shots I had taken looking across the bridge showed nothing unusual, no shimmer, no distortion. My rational mind scrambled for purchase, hallucination. Sensory deprivation and isolation could do strange things to the brain. I had been alone for 5 days, pushing myself physically. Maybe my mind had simply created a phantom to explain the impossible. It was a plausible theory, one that I desperately wanted to believe. But as I sat there, trying to calm my racing pulse, a fragment of forgotten history surfaced in my memory. It was from an old book I'd read years ago, while researching the area, a 1797 account by the naturalist Benjamin Smith Barton. He wrote of the Cherokee legends of the people who inhabited these mountains before them. A strange, pale race they called the moon-eyed people, because their eyes were sensitive to the sun and they could only see well at night. The legends claimed the Cherokee had fought a great battle with them and expelled them from the region. But other versions of the story were vaguer, saying the moon-eyed people had simply vanished. I had dismissed it as fascinating folklore at the time, another local legend, like the Wampus Cat or the Mothman. But now, sitting in the oppressive silence of this forgotten gorge, the story took on a chilling new resonance. A people who couldn't bear the daylight. A people who vanished. I looked at the bridge, a stark, black line drawn across the landscape. A path that led halfway to nowhere. I decided against pushing onward. Instead, I would make camp here, a safe distance from the bridge, and observe. As dusk began to settle, draping the mountains in shades of purple and gray, the forest came alive with its usual chorus of insects and night birds. But tonight, every sound felt freighted with meaning. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves, made me jump. The familiar wilderness now felt alien and menacing. I built a small, smokeless fire, more for the comfort of its light than for warmth, and sat with my back against a solid wall of rock. My gaze remained fixed on the bridge, a skeletal silhouette against the darkening sky, waiting for the full moon to rise, and wondering what might come out when it did. Night fell like a shroud over the gorge. The moon, a day past full, rose above the sharp silhouette of the eastern ridge, bathing the landscape in a sterile, silver light. My small fire was a lonely spark of orange against the overwhelming dark. Every snap of a twig, every rustle of leaves in the undergrowth, sent a jolt through my system. The familiar sounds of the Appalachian night. usually a comfort, now seemed like a language I couldn't understand, full of whispers and warnings. My training as a ranger, my years of cultivating a deep, seated calm in the face of isolation, felt like a thin veneer over a much more primal fear. I was an intruder here, and I was beginning to understand that the wilderness was not just indifferent to my presence. It was actively hostile. My gaze was fixed on the bridge. In the moonlight, it looked even more skeletal, a ribcage of ancient, creosoted timbers picked clean by time. And at its center, exactly where the footprints had vanished, the air began to shimmer again. It was more pronounced now, less like heat haze, and more like a tear in the fabric of the night. A wound in the world through which the cold moonlight seemed to bend and distort. The low thrumming returned, a vibration that resonated deep in my chest, a audible frequency that felt like the world's lowest note being played on some colossal, unseen instrument. I raised my binoculars, my hands unsteady. The shimmering patch of air was no longer just a visual distortion. Through the lenses, I could see things moving within it. Not clearly, but as fleeting, translucent shapes, like faulty projections on a screen of smoke. They were figures, I thought, tall and gaunt, moving with a jerky, unnatural rhythm. They seemed to be working, engaged in some frantic, silent labor upon the bridge that wasn't there. Then came the sounds. At first, it was faint, carried on the wind, the distant, metallic clang of a hammer on steel. Then, the unmistakable, rhythmic chuffing of a steam engine, a sound that had not been heard in these mountains for nearly a century. It grew louder, closer, accompanied by the screech of wheels on rails and the sharp, piercing blast of a locomotive's whistle. My rational mind screamed at me, auditory hallucination, the product of isolation, stress, and the power of suggestion in a place steeped in history. But the sounds were too real, too layered. I could hear the shouts of men, their voices thin and reedy, lost in the cacophony of the phantom industry. I could almost smell the coal smoke and hot metal, a ghost of the Little River lumber company's brutal assault on this wilderness. The logging camps of that era were notoriously dangerous places. Men were maimed and killed with terrifying regularity, crushed by falling trees, mangled in the gears of steam, powered skidders, or lost in the frequent, deadly railroad accidents. This bridge, a monument to that ambition, must have claimed its share of lives. Was this what I was witnessing? A replay of some long-forgotten tragedy, trapped in a loop by the strange properties of this place. A localized temporal anomaly, as the physicists might call it. A place where time itself was broken. The shimmering intensified, and the figures within it became marginally clearer. They were not just loggers. Among the spectral forms of men in overalls and heavy boots, I saw others. They were smaller, paler, their movements furtive and strange. They seemed to be fleeing from the industrial phantoms, their forms dissolving and reforming in the distorted air. The moon-eyed people. The Cherokee legend had said they were driven from these mountains, expelled by the Cherokee themselves. But what if that wasn't the whole story? What if they had simply retreated into a place the Cherokee could not follow? a place between places. The legend claimed a Cherokee had attacked them on a night of the full moon because their sensitive eyes couldn't bear the bright light. And here I was, under a brilliant moon, watching their ghostly forms flicker in and out of existence. The thought that had chilled me earlier returned with the force of a physical blow. This place eats time. It didn't just record it. It consumed it, trapping echoes of the past. The loggers, the moon-eyed people. The hiker who had left his footprints. In this one, terrible spot. Suddenly, the cacophony of the phantom train ceased. The silence that fell was absolute and profound, more complete than any natural quiet I had ever experienced. The shimmering on the bridge pulsed once, violently, and then stabilized, a placid, wavering window in the center of the span. The thrumming in my chest subsided. For a long moment, nothing happened. The gorge was still, holding its breath. Then, from the heart of the shimmer, a single figure emerged. It was not a ghost. It was solid, three-dimensional, and it stepped out of the distortion and onto the solid timbers of the bridge. It was small and slender, wrapped in what looked like dark, heavy furs, its face obscured by a deep hood. It stood perfectly still at the exact midpoint of the bridge, the place where the hiker's footprints had ended. It turned its head slowly, scanning the darkness on my side of the gorge. Even from this distance, I felt its gaze lock onto my position. The primal fear I'd felt before was nothing compared to the pure, undiluted terror that now flooded my veins. This was not a replay of the past. This was the present. The presence I had felt was no longer just a feeling. It was here. I was frozen, unable to move. My binoculars pressed so hard against my face they hurt. The figure took a step toward me. Then another. It moved with a silent, fluid grace that was utterly inhuman. It crossed the invisible line where the hiker's journey had ended and kept coming. I lowered the binoculars, my breath catching in my throat. My mind, desperately clinging to the training and discipline of my profession, screamed at me to document. I fumbled for my camera, my fingers numb and clumsy. I raised it, zoomed the lens, and tried to focus on the approaching figure. But the image in the viewfinder was a blur, a smear of darkness against the moonlit bridge. My hands were shaking too violently. The figure stopped again, now only 100 feet away. It slowly raised a hand and pushed back its hood. The face was bone, white, with a flat, broad nose and a lipless slit of a mouth. But the eyes were what broke me. They were huge, perfectly round, and they glowed with a soft, milky luminescence of their own, like two full moons in the pale landscape of its face. They were the eyes of a creature that had never seen the sun, and they were fixed directly on me. The moon-eyed man. He was real. A sound escaped my lips, a choked gasp. The creature's head tilted, as if in curiosity. It had heard me. That single, small sound shattered my paralysis. I scrambled backward, away from the firelight, crab walking over roots and rocks, my pack digging into my spine. I didn't take my eyes off the figure on the bridge. It remained motionless, watching me, its luminous eyes burning holes in the darkness. I reached the tree line and forced myself to my feet. turning and plunging into the rhododendron. Hell, I had fought my way through that afternoon. Branches whipped at my face, snagged my clothes. I didn't care. I ran blindly, fueled by a terror so profound it was a physical force. A pressure from behind pushing me onward. The only thought in my head was to put distance between myself and that bridge. Between myself and those glowing, moon-like eyes. I didn't stop until my lungs were burning and my legs gave out. I collapsed at the base of an ancient oak, gasping for air, my body trembling uncontrollably. The sounds of the forest had returned, but now they were just sounds. The oppressive, intelligent silence of the gorge was gone. I was alone again, but I knew, with a certainty that went deeper than logic, that I was being hunted. The mystery of the footprints was solved. They didn't stop. They were taken. And now, the thing that had taken the hiker knew I was here. I had looked into its world, and it had looked back into mine. As the first hint of gray began to lighten the eastern sky, I forced myself to move. There would be no more observation, no more reports. There was only survival. I had to get back to the ranger station, back to the world of rules and reasons. But as I shouldered my pack and began the grueling 5-day trek back, a new, horrifying thought took root in my mind. The footprints only ever went halfway across. It was a one-way trip. And I had just seen what was waiting on the other side. The 5-day hike back to my station was a descent into a private hell. The wilderness that had been my sanctuary for 2 decades, transformed into a place of profound menace. Every rustle of leaves was the footfall of something silent and pale. Every snap of a twig was the breaking of a bone. The familiar, imposing mountains no longer felt ancient and serene. They felt remote, untamed, and actively hostile. I moved with a frantic, desperate energy, fueled by adrenaline, and a terror so deep it felt like a physical illness. I barely slept, jolting awake at every nocturnal sound. The image of those luminous, moon-like eyes burned onto the inside of my eyelids. I ate cold rations on the move, too terrified to stop and build a fire, convinced its light would be a beacon in the oppressive dark. My professional training, my ingrained discipline, was a thin shield against the primal fear that had taken root in my soul. I was no longer a steward of this land. I was prey. When I finally stumbled out of the tree line and saw the familiar gravel road leading to the ranger station, I nearly collapsed with relief. I was gaunt, filthy, my face and arms a crotchet of scratches from my flight through the rhododendron hells. My supervisor, a man named Henderson who had known me for 15 years, took one look at my wild-eyed, haunted expression and his face clouded with concern. "Elias, what in God's name happened to you?" I tried to explain. I sat in the sterile quiet of the debriefing room, the fluorescent lights humming overhead, and I tried to put the impossible into words. I started with the facts, the things that could be entered into an official report. The discovery of an unmapped, early 20th century timber trestle bridge. The single set of footprints. The lack of any evidence of a fall or a return journey. Henderson listened patiently, nodding, his pen scratching against the official incident form. This was all within the realm of the explainable, if unusual. A missing hiker, a tragic accident in a remote sector. But then I faltered. How could I report a shimmering distortion in the air? A phantom train. A creature with glowing eyes that stepped out of a tear in reality. The words died in my throat. I saw the look on Henderson's face. A mixture of professional concern and a dawning, clinical assessment of my mental state. I knew what he was thinking: isolation, exhaustion, hallucination. The well-documented psychological toll of a life spent too long alone in the deep woods. So I censored myself. I edited my own reality. I mentioned a feeling of unease, possible auditory and visual distortions due to fatigue, and concluded that the subject of the footprints was likely deceased. Cause unknown. Search of the immediate area inconclusive. I filed a report that was technically true, but a profound lie. Henderson accepted it, but his gaze was still troubled. He recommended, strongly, that I take my accumulated leave. All of it. Get some rest, Elias, he said, his voice gentle. Get your feet back on solid ground. The other rangers were kind, but there was a new distance in their eyes. The story, in its sanitized, officially palatable form, had made the rounds. I was no longer Elias Thorne, the steady, unflappable backcountry veteran. I was the man who'd gotten spooked by shadows, the one who'd spent a few too many nights alone. My isolation, once a professional asset, had become a mark of instability. I retreated to my personal cabin, a small, rustic structure on the park's periphery that had always been my refuge. But there was no peace to be found. The woods surrounding my home were no longer a comfort. I spent my days in a fever of research, poring over old logging company maps, historical archives, and obscure folklore collections. I reread Benjamin Smith Barton's account of the moon-eyed people, his words now feeling less like folklore and more like a field report. I searched for any mention of my bridge, any record of a logging camp accident so horrific it might have torn a hole in the world. I found nothing. The bridge, and the thing that inhabited it, remained an anomaly, a data point that fit no known pattern. My nights were sleepless, filled with a gnawing dread. I'd sit in the dark, a shotgun across my lap, listening to the sounds of the forest, trying to distinguish the natural from the unnatural. I was caught in a liminal space of my own, trapped between the rational world I had always known and the impossible truth I had witnessed. My mind felt like that shimmering air on the bridge, a place where two realities bled into one another, creating a constant, nauseating distortion. Weeks turned into a month. The sharp edges of my terror began to dull, replaced by a heavy, bone-deep exhaustion. I started to tell myself that Henderson was right. It had been a hallucination, a waking nightmare born of solitude and stress, a hiccup in my perception of time and space, as one psychology book I read put it. I began to sleep again, in short, fitful bursts. I started to believe I might be able to reclaim my life, to file the memory of the bridge away as a traumatic, but ultimately unreal event. Then came last night. I was sitting in my armchair, reading a book. The silence of the cabin broken, only by the whisper of turning pages and the low hum of the refrigerator. It was a normal sound, a comforting sound. But then another sound began to bleed through it, a low, sub-audible thrumming. I froze, the book falling from my hands. It was the sound from the bridge, the vibration I had felt in my bones, the one that signaled the thinning of the world. It was faint, distant, but it was unmistakably here. My heart hammered against my ribs. I told myself it was the refrigerator, a truck on the distant highway, my own overstrained imagination. But the thrumming grew, a steady, resonant pulse that seemed to come from the very air around me. A floorboard on the front porch creaked. My blood ran cold. I was paralyzed, every muscle locked in a rictus of pure terror. I sat there for what felt like an eternity, listening to the crushing silence that followed. Nothing. Maybe it was a deer, a raccoon, a branch falling. My rational mind, my ranger's mind, offered up a dozen plausible explanations. But they were all lies. Slowly, my body trembling, I forced myself to stand. I crept to the window that overlooked the porch, my hand shaking so badly I could barely part the curtains. I peered out into the inky, moonless dark. At first, I saw nothing but the familiar shapes of the trees, black against a starless sky. Then I saw them. 2 points of soft, milky light, floating in the darkness, just beyond the porch railing. They were perfectly round, and they glowed with their own internal, malevolent luminescence. They were not reflecting light. They were the source of it. It had followed me. It had crossed the bridge. It had crossed the 5 days of wilderness. It had found my home. The boundary wasn't the bridge. The boundary was me. The eyes blinked, once, slowly. And as I stood there, trapped in their gaze, a single, horrifying thought crystallized in my mind, clear and cold as the grave. The footprints only ever went halfway across, because that was the price of admission. You give it your path, and in return, it takes yours. And now, it had come to collect. My name is Dr. Eris Thorne. It is a title I worked hard for. A doctorate in geomatics with a post-doctoral specialization in remote ecological surveying. For the past 7 years, I have been employed by Aetherid Geomatics, a firm that occupies a very specific, very lucrative niche in the corporate world. We provide comprehensive environmental impact assessments for clients with sensitive, high-value projects. In layman's terms, we soon discovered why. When a corporation with a name you would recognize wants to build something in a place they'd rather you not know about, they call us. My work is a blend of high technology and rugged fieldwork. It involves analyzing multispectral satellite imagery, processing vast amounts of geographical data through GIS software, and then validating that data on the ground, often in the most isolated locations on the planet. My standard deployment kit is a testament to the precision my work demands. It includes a Trimble Prox GPS unit for sub-meter positional accuracy, a portable YSI multi-parameter probe for real-time water quality analysis, and for high-stakes topographical mapping, a Leica total station that can measure angles with an accuracy of 3 seconds. For penetrating dense forest canopies, which is often the case, I utilize a drone equipped with a state of the ART LIDAR system. I am a scientist. My world is one of quantifiable data, verifiable facts, and detailed, objective reports. I deal in numbers and sensor readings, not superstition. It is a mindset that has served me well. From the unstable volcanic fields of the Congo to the thawing permafrost of Siberia. This is why, when the contract for Isla Perdita came across my desk, I viewed it through the same dispassionate lens. The assignment was straightforward, if unusually classified, a 3-month solo survey of a newly charted, privately owned island in a remote stretch of the Pacific Ocean. The client, shielded behind the usual layers of corporate anonymity, required a comprehensive biodiversity and geological assessment prior to exploring development potential. The pay was astronomical, even by Aethelred standards, and the non-disclosure agreement was thicker than my doctoral thesis. These were flags, certainly, but not ones I hadn't seen before. In my line of work, secrecy is currency. I signed the contract, packed my gear, and prepared for 3 months of professional solitude. The journey ended with a helicopter drop-off, the rhythmic thumping of the rotors fading into an oppressive silence. That was my first true impression of the island. It was a silence that felt profound, unnatural. Most wild places have a voice. The buzz of insects, the call of birds, the rustle of wind through leaves. Isla Perdita was muted, as if holding its breath. I stood on the black volcanic sand of the beach, watching the helicopter shrink to a speck on the horizon, feeling an acute sense of isolation that was both familiar and, in this place, uniquely unsettling. My initial survey of the immediate area revealed an ecosystem that was, for lack of a better term, bizarre. As a biologist by training, I recognized features that were scientifically fascinating yet deeply wrong. Many of the woody shrubs exhibited extreme, divaricate branching, a dense, tangled network of wide, angled, interlacing branches with small, sparse leaves. It's an evolutionary defense mechanism, typically developed in response to browsing by large, flightless birds like the moa of New Zealand. But there were no such animals here. There shouldn't have been for millennia. It was a defense against a ghost. The flora also displayed startling examples of island gigantism. Ferns with thick, leathery fronds stood as tall as a man. The trees were unlike any I had cataloged before, their trunks swollen and pale, storing water like the desert, dwelling bottle trees of Socotra, despite the humid, tropical climate. The air was heavy and cloying, thick with the scent of damp soil, rotting vegetation, and something else I couldn't place. A faint, metallic sweetness, like old blood and ozone. I established my base of operations, a pre-fabricated habitat module, air, dropped with my gear. It was a self-contained unit, complete with an atmospheric reclamation unit for water, solar power, and a satellite uplink for data transfer. As I initiated the startup sequence, my instruments began their preliminary scans. That's when I first detected the hum. It was a persistent, low-frequency vibration, registering on my equipment at just below 20 AC, on the very threshold of human hearing. I made a note in my log. Potential geological source, possibly subterranean water flow or unusual atmospheric resonance. Subjects exposed to similar frequencies have reported feelings of unease or anxiety. I could already feel it myself. Slight, unnerving pressure in my ears, a baseless sense of dread that I dismissed as a product of my own suggestion. Inside the habitat, sealed away from the silent coast, I found the mission addendum. It was a single, laminated card, tucked into a wax-sealed envelope labeled Addendum 4B, Mandatory Environmental and Personal Conduct Protocols Isla Perdita. I chuckled to myself, expecting a list of corporate platitudes about environmental stewardship and safety regulations. My amusement faded as I began to read. The protocols were specific, nonsensical, and carried the cold, implicit weight of a threat. They were not suggestions, they were rules. Protocol EP01 scene. All field survey activities must cease at 1700 local time. All personnel must be secured within the habitat module between 17:30 and 60:00. A compliance notee non-negotiable. The habitat's outer seals are time-locked during this period. Protocol EP02. Do not consume any native flora or fauna. Water must be sourced only from atmospheric reclamation unit. La compliance note. Risk of unknown biological contaminants and neurotoxins. Protocol EP03E at dusk. The forest floor may exhibit widespread bioluminescence. Do not approach or attempt to sample glowing fungal bodies. Maintain a minimum distance of 10 meters. A compliance note: ocular and dermal exposure risk unquantified. Protocol EP04. If you observe a stationary, tall, pale figure among the trees, the observer, do not approach. Do not make direct eye contact. Avert your gaze and return to the habitat module immediately. Compliance note. Do not log visual contact in the primary mission log. Use supplementary personal log only. Protocol EP05. If you hear a singing or whispering voice on the wind, activate the habitat's external sonic dampeners. Freak. 19 Aziv and remain inside for 1 hour. Compliance note. Do not attempt to record the audio. This is a known atmospheric phenomenon. Protocol EP06C. All waste material must be incinerated on site. Any biological samples must be stored in the provided triple, sealed cryo containers. Compliance notee. Prevent cross-contamination of the unique ecosystem. I read the list 3 times. My scientific mind scrambled to impose order on the chaos. EP02 and EP06 were logical containment procedures, standard for a pristine ecosystem. But the others, they were the stuff of campfire stories, not corporate directives. The observer. The instruction not to log sightings in the official record. And most chillingly, EP05. The specific mention of 19HC. This wasn't a random frequency. It was the precise frequency identified in scientific studies as capable of inducing visual and auditory hallucinations, feelings of intense fear, paranoia, and a sense of a presence. The implication was staggering. Athaured Geomatics, my rational, data-driven employer, knew about this atmospheric phenomenon. They knew it was capable of causing profound psychological distress, and they had engineered a specific countermeasure for it. The rule wasn't to protect me from the island. It was to protect the mission's integrity from my own compromised perceptions. The cold knot of apprehension in my stomach tightened. This wasn't just a survey. I was a lab rat, and the maze was an entire island. The first test came sooner than I expected. As the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in lurid shades of orange and purple, I was inside the habitat, collating my initial atmospheric readings. That's when I heard it. A faint, melodic sound carried on the wind. It was a voice singing a tune with no discernible words, both beautiful and deeply unsettling. My mind, the mind of Dr. Aris Thorne, immediately supplied a rational explanation. It was the wind, whistling through the island's strange, porous rock formations, creating an Aeolian harp effect. It was a trick of acoustics. But the sound was too structured, the melody too deliberate. And with it came a wave of pure, irrational anxiety. A throbbing headache could be built behind my eyes, and the pressure in my ears intensified. The feeling of being watched was no longer a vague sense of unease, it was a certainty. I felt a primal urge to flee, to hide, even though I was already sealed inside a reinforced habitat module. I looked at the console, at the button for the sonic dampeners. My professionalism, my entire identity as a man of science, rebelled against the act. To press that button was to admit that the rules were real, that there was something out there beyond the scope, my instruments and understanding. It was an admission of fear, but the singing grew louder, the melody weaving itself into the fabric of my thoughts, and the headache was becoming unbearable. My hand trembled as I reached out and activated the system. A low, almost sub-audible thrum filled the habitat, the 19s counter frequency. The singing on the wind didn't stop, but it was as if a pane of thick glass had been lowered between it and me. The headache receded almost instantly. The crushing anxiety lessened, replaced by a cold, sharp-edged fear. The silence that returned was no longer peaceful. It was watchful. I had followed the rule. I had passed the first test. I spent the rest of the night staring out of the habitat's reinforced polycarbonate window into the encroaching darkness. The strange, metallic sweet scent of the air somehow seeping through the seals. I was a scientist sent to survey an island, but I was beginning to understand that the island and the corporation that sent me here was also surveying me, and I had no idea what would happen if I failed. The first week on Isla Perdita passed in a haze of disciplined routine and simmering paranoia. Each morning, I would rise before the OR's 600 unlock, my body already humming with a low, great anxiety that had become my new baseline. I would force down a nutrient paste, run a full diagnostic on my equipment, and step out of the habitat module the second the seals hissed open. My world was one of data, and I clung to it, like a castaway to a piece of driftwood. The numbers were my shield against the island's oppressive, watchful silence. My days were spent in methodical transects, pushing deeper into the island's interior. I was a ghost in this alien landscape, my presence marked only by the precise grid of sample points and GPS markers I left in my wake. The island's ecology continued to defy easy categorization. I logged species of flora that had no business growing in this climate, their adaptations suggesting a geological and evolutionary history that was a scientific impossibility. I found more of the divaricate shrubs, their tangled, defensive branches a constant, nagging question. One afternoon, while taking a soil core sample near a dense thicket, I found them fossilized tracks pressed deep into what was now stone. They were tridactyl, clearly avian, but the scale was monstrous. Each print was the size of my torso. Mo were giants, but this was something else entirely. A defense against a ghost, I had thought. Now I had proof the ghost was real. My lidar drone became my primary tool, its laser pulses painting a three-dimensional map of the island with unerring accuracy. The data it sent back was pristine, a cartographer's dream. But as I stitched the point clouds together, anomalies began to appear. Fleeting shadows in the data, non-geological and inconsistent, that seemed to shift between scans. I ran the error correction software 3 times, but the artifacts remained. I logged it as a persistent sensor glitch, a magnetic interference from the island's iron-rich volcanic rock. It was a logical explanation, but it didn't feel true. My own mind, the objective, analytical mind of Dr. Eris Thorne, was becoming an unreliable narrator. I adhered to the rules with the fanaticism of a zealot. Every survey ended at 1700 sharp. I was back inside the habitat. Seals locked by 1730. I drank only the reed water from the atmospheric unit, ate only my pre-packaged rations. The rules were my new religion, and fear was its sacrament. But faith is tested. And my first true test since the singing came on the 8th day. As the sun began its descent, I was making my way back to the habitat when the forest floor began to change. It started as a faint, ethereal glimmer, a smattering of pale green light on the damp earth. Within minutes, the entire forest understory was alight. It was bioluminescence, but on a scale I had never imagined possible. Vast, interconnected networks of mycelium, pulsed with a soft, sickly, yellow-green glow, tracing intricate patterns across the ground like a circuit board designed by a mad god. The light was hypnotic, a silent, cold fire that painted the swollen, pale tree trunks in grotesque relief, making them look like the bones of some colossal skeleton. My scientific curiosity warred with the primal fear that now lived in my gut. I had a spectrometer in my kit. I could have taken a sample, analyzed its composition, quantified the phenomenon. It was my job, my very purpose for being there. I took a half step forward, my hand reaching for my pack. Protocol EP-03 at dusk. The forest floor may exhibit widespread bioluminescence. Do not approach or attempt to sample glowing fungal bodies. Maintain a minimum distance of 10 meters. The words from the laminated card flashed in my mind, cold and absolute. I froze, my breath catching in my chest. As I watched, the light seemed to intensify, the pulsing rhythm quickening, as if it were aware of my presence, my temptation. It felt like a lure. I stumbled backward, turning my back on the most extraordinary natural discovery of my career, and fled to the sterile safety of the habitat. The automatic locks sealing behind me sounded like a judgment. That night, sleep offered no escape. My dreams were a feverish landscape of glowing forests and impossible, giant birds. I woke up drenched in sweat, the 19s hum of phantom pressure in my ears. I sat at my workstation, trying to lose myself in data analysis. but my eyes kept drifting to the reinforced window. And then I saw it. At the edge of the tree line, just beyond the sterile cone of the habitat's exterior lights, stood a figure. It was tall, impossibly so, and bone-pale. In the moonlight, it was utterly motionless, a sliver of wrongness against the backdrop of the tangled woods. I couldn't discern any features. No face, no clothes. Just a humanoid shape stretched beyond its natural proportions. My mind screamed. Observe. Document, photograph, quantify. This was a discovery that would change the foundations of biology, of everything. Protocol EP-04 scene. If you observe a stationary, tall, pale figure among the trees, the observer, do not approach. Do not make direct eye contact. Avert your gaze and return to the habitat module immediately. The rule. It wasn't a suggestion. It was a command born of a knowledge I didn't possess. I felt a physical pull to keep looking. A desperate need to understand what I was seeing. But the memory of the singing voice, the crushing anxiety, the glowing forest, it was all part of the same terrifying tapestry. With a surge of will that felt like tearing muscle, I wrenched my gaze away from the window. My heart hammered against my ribs, and a wave of vertigo washed over me. I had seen it. The observer was real. I stumbled over to my personal data pad, my fingers trembling over the keys. The rule was explicit. Do not log visual contact in the primary mission log. Use supplementary personal log only. The secrecy was the most terrifying part. Aethord, my employers, knew. They knew, and they didn't want a record. I typed a single, Stark entry 2317. Visual contact. EP-04. Complied. The following days eroded what was left of my scientific detachment. The island was no longer a subject of study. It was a sentient entity, and I was an intruder. I began to feel the infrasound hum constantly, a low thrum of dread that vibrated in my bones. I started talking to myself, my own voice a frail counterpoint to the island's profound silence. The rules became my obsession. I would read the laminated card over and over, searching for some hidden cipher, some key that would unlock the logic behind the madness. Were the rules a form of protection or a form of control? Were they meant to keep me safe or to keep me compliant in some grand, horrifying experiment? One night, unable to sleep, a new thought seized me. I had analyzed the island's flora, its water, its atmosphere. But I had never analyzed the tools of my own containment. I took out the laminated card, the list of rules that now govern my existence. Under the high-powered lens of my digital microscope, I examined the ink. I expected to see the uniform, synthetic polymers of modern printing. Instead, I saw a chaotic, organic matrix. Cellular structures. With trembling hands, I scraped a microscopic sample of the black ink onto a slide. My portable chemical analyzer whirred, its sensors breaking the substance down into its core components. The base was simple, archaic iron gal ink, a medieval concoction of iron salts and tannic acid. But it was bound with something else, a complex protein. A protein my system couldn't identify. On a desperate, wild hunch, I pulled up the DNA analysis from one of the strange, leathery, leaved plants I had sampled on my third day. I ran a cross comparison. The analyzer chirped. Partial match found. The blood drained from my face. The ink wasn't from Aethelred. It hadn't been printed in some sterile corporate facility. It had been made here. The card wasn't a mission directive from my employer. It was a warning, crafted from the very substance of the island itself. My eyes fell on the last two rules. Protocol EP06A. All waste material must be incinerated on site. Any biological samples must be stored in the provided sealed cryo containers. I had followed them without question, assuming they were standard protocols to prevent contamination of the island's pristine ecosystem. But now, a more horrifying interpretation bloomed in my mind. It wasn't about protecting the island from me. It was about protecting the outside world from the island. It was about containment. I looked at the row of gleaming cryo containers filled with the impossible evidence I had so diligently collected. I looked at the squat, efficient incinerator in the corner of the habitat. Then I looked at the satellite uplink, my only lifeline, my only path for the data to escape. The rules were not for my survival. They were for my imprisonment. And in that moment, I understood the final, unwritten rule, the one that underpinned all the others, with a clarity that was more terrifying than any observer in the trees. Nothing leaves. The revelation about the ink shattered my world. The laminated card, my Bible of survival, was no longer a set of instructions from my employer. It was a ransom note from my jailer. My habitat module, once a bastion of science and safety, now felt like a well-appointed cell on death row. The satellite uplink, my sole connection to the world I once knew, pulsed with a malevolent promise, a gateway for my data, but a trigger for my damnation. The final, unwritten rule echoed in the silent hum of the electronics. Nothing leaves. My scientific discipline, the bedrock of my identity, fractured. I was Dr. Eris Thorne, a man who dealt in quantifiable facts. But I was trapped in a place that operated on a logic of its own, a logic of predatory, sentient rules. The isolation began to eat at me in a way it never had before. It wasn't just loneliness, it was a profound, existential erosion. I found myself talking to the humming machinery, my voice a thin, reedy sound in the oppressive quiet. My logs, once crisp and objective, became rambling, paranoid entries, a dialogue with my own decaying sanity. I would read my own data, searching for glitches, for evidence of my own compromised perception. Was the infrasound making me see things? Or was the island simply showing me its true face? A new, defiant anger began to smolder beneath my fear. I was not just a victim. I was a collaborator. By following the rules, by dutifully collecting data that would never see the light of day, I was helping Aethelred maintain this prison. I was baiting the trap for the next scientist they would inevitably send. The thought was intolerable. I had to break the cycle. I had to break the rules. My rebellion began small. I stayed outside 5 minutes, past the 1700 curfew, my heart hammering against my ribs, with every tick of my chronometer. Nothing happened. The next day, 10 minutes. The silence felt heavier, more charged, but still no overt response. Emboldened, I decided to challenge a core tenet. Protocol EP05. I would record the singing. As dusk blotted across the sky, I set up a high-fidelity microphone outside the habitat, linked to my main console, and right on cue, it began. The ethereal, wordless melody drifted from the trees. I hit record. For a moment, there was only the pure, haunting sound. Then, my equipment screamed. A wave of static erupted from my speakers, so violent it blew the cones. The lights in the habitat flickered and died, plunging me into darkness. The 19s hum of the sonic dampeners kicked in automatically, a frantic, throbbing pulse that felt less like a shield and more like a cage rattling. When the emergency lights restored themselves a minute later, I looked at the recording file. It was corrupted beyond recovery. The island was not just a passive entity, it was a trickster, a malevolent intelligence that would not allow its secrets to be stolen. The island's response escalated. The next morning, lying on the doorstep of the habitat, was a single, enormous feather, iridescent black and impossibly large, like one from the fossilized tracks I had found. It was a message, a warning. The observer was no longer a distant figure at the edge of the woods. I would catch glimpses of it closer now, a pale flicker of movement between the swollen, water-hoarding trees, always just at the edge of my vision. It was a constant, unnerving presence, the physical manifestation of the island's will. My defiance hardened into a plan. I would not be another footnote in Aethoid's classified files. I would not be another ghost on this cursed island. I would send everything. My logs, the LiDAR data showing the impossible, shifting shadows, the chemical breakdown of the ink, the audio file of the static scream, the high-resolution photo of the feather, and my own testimony. A final, desperate warning to the world. I spent 2 days preparing the data packet, compressing it, encrypting it, my fingers flying across the console in a fever of purpose. This was my last act of science, my last act of defiance. On the final night, I sealed the habitat and bypassed the internal safeties on the satellite uplink. My heart pounded a frantic rhythm against the low, ever-present hum of the island. I initiated the transmission. A progress bar appeared on the screen, 1%. The lights flickered, 2%. A low groan echoed from the metal walls of the habitat, 3%. The singing began, not from outside, but from everywhere at once. A chorus of disembodied voices inside my own skull. The pressure in my ears was immense, my vision blurring at the edges. I looked out the window. The bioluminescent forest was pulsing in a furious, strobing rhythm, a sickly green heartbeat of pure rage. And there, pressed against the reinforced polycarbonate, was the observer. No longer a distant shape, but a defined horror. A long, pale, featureless face stared into the habitat, into me. There was no malice in its non-expression, only a profound, ancient stillness. It raised a long, white hand and touched the window. A spiderweb of cracks spread across the pane. The progress bar hit 5%. The power failed completely. The emergency lights sputtered and died, leaving me in absolute darkness, save for the hellish green glow of the forest and the pale, looming face at the window. The satellite console went silent. The transmission had failed. I don't know how long I sat there in the dark. Time had lost its meaning. The fear was gone, replaced by a strange, cold clarity. I picked up my personal datapad, its battery power a final, fleeting comfort. My hands, once trembling, were now perfectly steady. I began to type. My final log. Log entry final. Dr. Aristhorn. Mission terminated. The transmission failed. The primary hypothesis was incorrect. The rules are not for containment. They are for integration. The island doesn't want to be kept in. It wants to be understood. It chooses its surveyors. It tests them. It breaks them. And then it remakes them. My skin feels thin. The air no longer smells of ozone and rot. It smells of damp earth and chlorophyll. The hum is no longer a pressure in my ears. It is my own pulse. I feel a profound stillness settling into my bones. A desire to stand at the edge of the trees and simply watch. To observe. To wait for the next variable to be introduced to the experiment. I see now. The data was never meant to leave. The surveyor is the message. Work here is not over. It is just beginning. A new protocol is required. Protocol EP07I. Do not attempt to transmit data. The observer will ensure compliance.
My name is Senior Airman Michael Rourke, United States Air Force, Communications Technician. That title, which I had worked so hard to earn, felt like a shield. It was a definition, a purpose. It meant I was a man who understood signals, who could decipher order from the chaos of the ether. I thought I knew what my job was. I was wrong. My transfer orders came on a Tuesday. Cape Lisburne Air Force Station, Alaska. I had to look it up on a map. It was a tiny speck on the northwestern, most tip of the state, a place where the Chukchi Sea met the Arctic Ocean, closer to Siberia than to Anchorage. It was a relic of the Cold War, one of the original distant early warning DWs, line sites built to watch for Soviet bombers coming over the pole, a remote tour. The assignment papers said 12 months. It might as well have said a lifetime. The flight in was a prelude to the nightmare. After the relative comfort of the C-130 from Elmendorf, the final leg was on a smaller, rattling prop plane that felt like it was being held together by sheer willpower. The pilot, a civilian contractor with a face like a worn leather map, just grinned when he saw my white knuckles. They call this the hairiest landing strip in the world. He shouted over the engine's roar. He wasn't exaggerating. The plane made a gut-wrenching turn, banking hard into a ferocious crosswind, aiming for a short gravel runway carved into the base of a desolate mountain. For a moment, all I could see was the rock face, and I was sure we were going to become another ghost story told to new recruits. Then, with a bone-jarring thud, we were down. I stepped out into a world of gray and white. The wind was a physical force, a constant, shrieking pressure that stole the breath from my lungs and bit at any exposed skin. The base, or bottom camp, as they called it, was a collection of squat, wooden buildings connected by a series of covered walkways, their paint peeling from decades of Arctic abuse. They looked temporary, like they were never meant to last, which I later learned was true. They were designed with a 15-year life expectancy back in the 1950s. Above us, clinging to the summit of a 1,600-foot peak, was the top camp, where the giant white redome stood like a solitary, unblinking eye. The man who met me was Master Sergeant Henderson. He was wary and weathered, with eyes that seemed to be constantly scanning the horizon for something I couldn't see. There was a tremor in his hands that he tried to hide by clenching them into fists. He gave me a tour that was less welcoming and more of a warning. This is the mess hall. This is the barracks. That's the road to top camp, he said, his voice flat and devoid of emotion. You'll be working in the comms shack next to the old White Alice site. He pointed to a pair of massive, defunct Troposcatter antennas that looked like skeletal hands reaching for the sky. We ended the tour in a small, windowless briefing room. Henderson slid a thin, laminated binder across the table. Standard operating procedures, he said, but the look in his eyes said it was anything but standard. You read these. You memorize them. You live by them. You don't ask why. You just do it. Understand, Airman, I nodded, opening the binder. The first page was titled Cape Lisburne Special Orders. There were only 4. 1. All visual and auditory phenomena at the perimeter fence are to be considered meteorological in nature. Wind, snow, and ice can create deceptive effects. Do not investigate. Do not report anything other than weather-related interference in the log. I looked up at Henderson. Meteorological phenomena. Like what? His eyes narrowed, like the wind and the snow. Rook, that's all. I read the second rule. 2. From 2200 to the Oyo 6000, all radio channels are prone to severe static due to auroral interference. If this static resolves into what sounds like a human voice, you will note the time and frequency in the log. You will not, under any circumstances, attempt to respond. This was my domain. A voice? Like a bleed through from another transmission. No. Henderson said, his voice dropping to a near whisper. Not like a transmission, just a voice. We log it as auroral interference. Got it. I swallowed, and not tightening in my stomach. I moved to the third. 3. The local raven population is unusually large and intelligent. They are known to mimic sounds and leave objects near the barracks. Do not engage with them. Do not follow them, no matter how curious you are. They are not your friends. The rule was so specific, so bizarre, it felt like a line from a madman's diary. The Tlingit people, the natives of this region, considered the raven a trickster, a powerful being that could bring fortune or ruin. The rule suggested the Air Force had learned that lesson the hard way. Then I read the final rule, the one that made the hair on my arms stand up. 4. Any sounds of human distress heard outside the barracks after dark, specifically the sound of a woman screaming or a child crying, are to be ignored. They are auditory illusions caused by the wind passing through the old structures and antennas. Secure the doors and do not, for any reason, go outside to investigate. I stared at the words, my mind reeling. A crying child out here. The nearest civilian settlement was Point Hope, 25 miles away across the frozen tundra. It was impossible. I thought of the old legends I'd skimmed before my flight. Stories of the Kushtaka, the land otter men, shapeshifters who lured victims to their doom by mimicking the cries of a baby. This is a joke, right, Sergeant? I asked, forcing a laugh. Some kind of hazing for the new guy. Henderson didn't laugh. He leaned forward, his face a mask of raw, desperate seriousness. Do I look like I'm joking, Airman? We had a guy last year. A good man. Thought he heard his daughter crying for him out on the ice. He went outside. We found his boots in the morning. Just his boots. The silence in the room was absolute. The only sound was the howl of the wind outside, and for the first time, I thought I could hear a voice in it, a thin, wailing cry. The next few days were a blur of settling in and observing the strange, oppressive culture of the base. The men were ghosts, going through the motions with a quiet tension that was almost unbearable. They moved with a purpose, but their eyes were hollow haunted. They suffered from what the shrinks called winter over syndrome, insomnia, anxiety, paranoia. But this felt like more than that. This was a deep, knowing fear that had taken root in the soul of the station. On my third night, I was assigned my first solo shift in the comm shack from midnight to 8. Henderson walked me over, the wind trying to tear us from the narrow walkway. Just remember the rules. Rourke. He set his hand on the door. The rules keep you safe. He looked at me one last time, his eyes pleading. Don't be a hero. Then he was gone, swallowed by the swirling snow. I was alone. I stepped inside the shack, the door sealing behind me with a heavy, final-sounding clank. The room was filled with the glow of monitors and the low hum of electronics. Through the reinforced window, I could see nothing but a maelstrom of white. I was in a tiny bubble of light and warmth, surrounded by an endless, frozen wasteland. I sat down at the console, the 4 rules echoing in my head. I was a communications technician, a man of logic and signals. But as the clock ticked past 0300 and the static on the secondary channel began to hiss and crackle, I felt a primal dread that no amount of training could have prepared me for. Something was out there in the dark, and it knew we were listening. The first few hours of my shift were a study in monotony. I ran the standard diagnostics, monitored the primary channels for any traffic from Elmendorf, and watched the radar sweep its lazy green line across the screen, painting a picture of absolute emptiness. The only company was the incessant howl of the wind and the groan of the building settling under the weight of the snow. It was easy to see how the isolation could get to you, how the mind, starved for stimulus, could start creating its own. The men I'd seen in the mess hall weren't just tired, they were worn thin, their nerves frayed by the constant darkness, the confinement, and the oppressive silence. They were classic cases of winter over syndrome, a collection of psychological symptoms that plagued those stationed in polar environments. But Henderson's warning felt like it went beyond simple cabin fever. At 03:05, it started. A crackle on the secondary channel, the one that monitored broad, spectrum, low-frequency transmissions. It was designated for atmospheric research and was usually silent save for the occasional pop of distant lightning. Tonight, it hissed to life. At first, it was just white noise, the sound of a million tiny grains of sand being poured into my ear. This was the oral interference, the rules mentioned. I made a note of the time in the logbook, my pen scratching loudly in the quiet room. Then, the static began to change. It wasn't random anymore. A pattern was emerging from the chaos of cadence. The hiss coalesced into a thin, high-pitched wail. It was a sound that bypassed the ears and went straight to the primal core of my brain. It was the sound of a baby crying. It wasn't faint or distorted. It was crystal clear, as if the child were in the room with me. It was a sound of pure, unadulterated distress. A desperate, helpless cry for comfort, for warmth, for a mother. My blood ran cold. I leaned closer to the speaker, my heart pounding against my ribs. Every instinct, every fiber of my being screamed at me to respond. I was a communications technician. My job was to answer calls for help. My hand reached for the transmit switch. I could patch the signal through to the main comms, boost the antenna, try to get a location. There could be a downed plane out there, a private charter that had strayed off course. Survivors in the wreckage, huddled against the cold. But Henderson's words echoed in my mind. We found his boots in the morning, just his boots. I pulled my hand back as if the console were red hot. Rule Wade 40. Any sounds of human distress heard outside, specifically the sound of a woman screaming or a child crying, are to be ignored. But this wasn't outside. This was coming through my equipment. It was a signal. That fell under Rule Bay 2Z. If this static resolves into what sounds like a human voice, you will note the time and frequency in the log. You will not, under any circumstances, attempt to respond. The crying intensified, taking on a frantic, breathless quality. It was a sound meticulously engineered to trigger a rescue response. I thought of the folklore I'd read before my flight, the half-remembered tales of the Tlingit and other local peoples. Stories of the Kushtaka, the shape-shifting, land otter men. They were said to mimic the cries of a woman or a baby to lure unsuspecting victims into the wilderness, where they would be torn to shreds or, perhaps worse, transformed into one of them. It was a preposterous thought, a fairy tale from a forgotten time. I was a man of science and technology, sitting in a multi-million-dollar facility built on the principles of logic and reason. But the crying sounded so real. I squeezed my eyes shut, trying to rationalize it. It had to be a technical glitch, a signal crossing over, maybe from a satellite phone, transmission bouncing off the ionosphere. Or maybe it was just my mind, finally cracking under the pressure of this place. The psychologists called it impaired cognitive ability, a known symptom of extreme isolation. Was I hallucinating? I opened my eyes and stared at the audio levels on the monitor. The green bars were jumping in perfect sync with the cries. It was a real signal. It was being received. The crying stopped. Abruptly. The channel went back to dead silence, not even a hiss of static. The sudden absence of the sound was more jarring than its presence. The comms shack felt profoundly empty, the silence pressing in on me. I sat there for a long time, my own breathing loud in my ears, every nerve ending tingling. I looked at the logbook. My hand was shaking so badly I could barely hold the pen. What was I supposed to write? 0307. Heard phantom baby crying over the radio. Pretty sure it was a shape-shifting otter man. Send help? I'd be on the next flight out in a straitjacket. I remembered Henderson's face, the dead seriousness in his eyes. I remembered the second part of the rule. You will not, under any circumstances, attempt to respond. And the first rule, do not report anything other than weather-related interference in the log. They were all connected. It was a system, a procedure for survival. With a deep, shuddering breath, I wrote to 0307 significant static on secondary channel, consistent with severe auroral interference. Resolved into patterned audio artifact before clearing at 0309. It was a lie, but it felt like the truest thing I had ever written. The next morning, bleary-eyed and raw, I was summoned to the office of the station commander, Captain Eva Rostova. She was a stern, compact woman with Slavic features and eyes as gray and cold as the Chukchi Sea. She seemed as unyielding as the permafrost the base was built on. In the 20 years since the Nike Hercules missile systems were decommissioned, this place had become a backwater, but she ran it with the same Cold War intensity as if Soviet bombers were still expected over the pole at any minute. She held my logbook in her hands, open to the last page. Senior Airman Rook, she said, her voice flat, betraying no emotion. She tapped a finger on my entry from the night before. I reviewed your log. This entry regarding auroral interference. She looked up at me, her gaze pinning me to the spot. Good work. That's exactly how we logged those events. You followed protocol perfectly. She closed the book with a soft thud that sounded like a gavel. Dismissed. There was no praise in her voice, no warmth, only a cold, hard finality. I walked out of her office feeling a chill that had nothing to do with the Alaskan air. I had passed a test. I had followed the rules. And in doing so, I had just become a willing participant in a conspiracy of silence. A silent agreement to pretend the things we heard in the dark were just tricks of the wind and static in the wires. I now understood that the fear in the other men's eyes wasn't just from isolation. It was the fear of knowing that the rules were the only thing keeping the night at bay, and that the things they were designed to protect us from were very, very real. My good work in the logbook was an initiation. I had crossed an invisible threshold, and the other men knew it. The way they looked at me changed. The guarded suspicion was replaced by a kind of wary camaraderie, the shared glance of survivors who know the same terrible secret. We were all liars, bound together by the fiction we maintained in our official records. The oppressive quiet in the mess hall, the haunted, hollowed-out expressions. It wasn't just the winter, over syndrome the manuals described. It was the strain of actively denying the evidence of our own senses, day after day. The isolation began to work on me in ways I hadn't anticipated. Time became fluid, marked only by the shift changes and the perpetual twilight outside. The constant wind was a voice, whispering against the buildings, and I started hearing phantom sounds. A footstep in an empty hallway, a muttered word that was just the groan of freezing metal. My sleep was shallow and plagued by nightmares of a crying child lost in an endless blizzard. This place was a pressure cooker for the mind, designed to break you down, and the rules were the only thing holding the pieces together. Then came the ravens. Rule Funny 3, the local raven population is unusually large and intelligent. They are known to mimic sounds and leave objects near the barracks. Do not engage with them. Do not follow them, no matter how curious you are. They are not your friends. I dismissed it as the strangest, most arbitrary rule, but I came to understand it was perhaps the most insidious. They were everywhere. Huge, glossy black birds with an intelligence in their obsidian eyes that felt ancient and unnerving. They weren't like normal birds. They didn't scatter when you approached. They watched. They gathered on the railings of the covered walkways and on the skeletal arms of the old white Alice Traposcatter antennas, their heads cocked as if they were listening, judging. In the folklore of the Tlingit and other Athabascan peoples, Raven was a central figure, a creator, a trickster, a being of immense power who could walk between worlds. Here at Cape Lisburn, that mythology felt less like legend and more like an operational assessment. One afternoon, during my shift, one of them landed on the windowsill of the comms shack. It was enormous, larger than any raven I had ever seen. It stared at me, its head tilted. Then it tapped its beak against the triple paned glass. Tap, tap, tap. The sound was sharp, deliberate. I froze, remembering the rule. Do not engage with them. I tried to ignore it, turning back to my console, but the tapping continued, insistent. Finally, I glanced back. The raven dropped something from its beak onto the sill. It was small and metallic, glinting dully against the gray sky. The bird gave one last look at me, a look that felt impossibly knowing, and then launched itself into the wind, disappearing into the flurry of snow. For 10 minutes I sat there, my heart hammering against my ribs. Curiosity warred with a primal fear. The rule was clear, but the object was just sitting there. It wasn't a rock or a piece of trash. It looked like a locket. Breaking my own resolve, I cracked the window just enough to snatch it from the sill, the Arctic air biting at my fingers. It was a small silver locket, tarnished by weather. It felt cold, unnaturally so. With trembling fingers, I pried it open. Inside, protected from the elements, were 2 tiny, faded photographs. On one side, a young woman with a hopeful smile. On the other, a little girl, no older than 5, with the same smile. A cold dread washed over me. This wasn't some random object. This was a treasure. This belonged to someone. That evening in the mess hall, the locket felt heavy in my pocket. I took it out, staring at the faces under the dim fluorescent lights. Master Sergeant Henderson was sitting a few tables away, stirring his coffee with a hand that shook so badly it rattled the cup in its saucer. His eyes, constantly scanning the room, fell on the locket in my hand. He went rigid. The color drained from his face. The cup slipped from his trembling fingers and shattered on the floor. "Where did you get that?" He hissed, his voice a ragged whisper that cut through the low murmur of the room. Before I could answer, he was on his feet, stumbling towards me. "That's Connolly's." He choked out, pointing a shaking finger at the locket. "That's his little girl. He showed it to me the day he got here. Connolly, the name of the man who went outside, the man whose boots were all they found." "A raven," I stammered. It left it on the windowsill. Henderson let out a sound that was half sob, half scream. "They marked you." He shrieked, his eyes wild with terror. "They're watching you! They're their eyes! They watch you and then they call for you!" "Don't you understand? They call for you." 2 burly security airmen were on him in an instant, grabbing his arms. Captain Rostova emerged from her office as if she had been waiting for this. Her face was a mask of cold fury. "Get him to the infirmary," she ordered, her voice like cracking ice. Henderson was still raving as they dragged him out, screaming about voices in the static and faces in the snow. The mess hall was dead silent. Every eye was on me. Rostova walked over to my table. She didn't look at me. She looked at the locket in my hand. "Give it to me, airman," she said. It wasn't a request. I numbly placed it in her outstretched palm. She snapped it shut without looking inside and slipped it into her pocket. "You will forget you ever saw that," she said, her gray eyes finally meeting mine. They were devoid of any emotion, but held a warning that was as clear as a blade. "You will not speak of this to anyone. You will go back to your duties. You will follow the rules. Is that understood?" "Yes, Captain," I whispered. She turned and walked away, leaving me alone at the table, the gazes of the other men burning into me. I had seen behind the curtain. The rules weren't just a protocol for dealing with strange phenomena. They were a fragile dam holding back a flood of madness and horror. Henderson wasn't suffering from winter over syndrome. He was suffering from knowing the truth. He had seen what happens when the rules are broken, and the knowledge had shattered him. That night, I couldn't sleep. I stood at the window of my small room in the barracks, staring out into the swirling darkness. The wind howled, and this time I didn't try to pretend it wasn't speaking. It was, and it was learning my name. On the skeletal frame of the nearest White Alice antenna, a dozen black shapes were perched, motionless against the storm. They weren't sleeping. They were watching the barracks. They were watching me, and I understood with chilling certainty that Rule 83 was not about the Ravens. It was about what the Ravens worked for. After Henderson was taken away, a new kind of silence fell over the station. It wasn't the tense, watchful quiet from before. It was the dead silence of a tomb. We all knew what had broken him. It wasn't the isolation or the darkness. It was the truth. He had looked into the abyss one too many times, and the abyss had stared back, wearing the face of a dead man's child. The locket was never mentioned again. Captain Rostova's cold efficiency was absolute. Henderson was flown out on the next transport, his records citing a severe case of winter over syndrome, a neat, clinical explanation for a soul that had been fractured by the impossible. I was the new pariah. The men avoided my gaze, stepping away when I entered a room. I was the one who had found the locket. I was the one the Ravens had marked. I was a lightning rod, and no one wanted to be standing next to me when the storm broke. The Ravens were my constant, silent observers. They sat on the antennas on the rooftops, their black eyes following my every move. They were no longer just birds. They were sentinels, messengers for something ancient and hungry that lived in the wind and the ice. The nights in the comms shack became a form of torture. Every burst of static, every groan of the building sent a jolt of adrenaline through me. I logged the auroral interference with a numb, mechanical precision, never letting myself listen too closely to the patterns within the noise. I was surviving on coffee and fear, my nerves stretched taut like the guy, wires holding the antennas against the gale. The psychological strain was immense. I felt my own cognitive abilities fraying, my thoughts becoming a paranoid loop. The final test came 2 weeks before my tour was scheduled to end. The storm that night was a monster, a physical assault of wind and snow that made the entire station shudder. I was in my room in the barracks, trying and failing to read. When I heard it, it wasn't over the radio, it was outside. A woman screaming. I froze, the book falling from my hands. Rule 84. Any sounds of human distress heard outside the barracks after dark, specifically the sound of a woman screaming or a child crying, are to be ignored. It was an auditory illusion. The wind shrieking through the old, derelict structures. That's what the rules said. That's what I had to believe. But then the screaming sharpened into words, a name, carried on a gust of wind that rattled my window.
Michael! Oh God, Michael, help me! It's so cold!
My blood turned to ice water. It was my mother's voice. It was impossible. She was thousands of miles away, safe in her suburban home in Ohio. Couldn't be her. And yet the sound was perfect. Her exact tone, her specific inflection, the way her voice rose in panic. It was a sound I hadn't heard since I was a child, when I'd fallen from a tree and broken my arm. It was the sound of my mother's terror, reserved only for me. I scrambled to the door, my hand hovering over the lock. This was the lure. The ultimate, personalized trap. The Kushtaka. The land ottermen of Tlingit legend were said to do this. To mimic the voices of loved ones to draw their victims out. They didn't just play a random sound, they played your sound. They reached into your heart and found the one thing you couldn't ignore.
Michael, please! I can't feel my hands! Open the door!
The voice was closer now, right outside. A frantic, desperate pounding began on the heavy steel door of the barracks. I backed away, stumbling over my own feet, my mind a whirlwind of terror and confusion. I thought of Connolly. We found his boots in the morning. Just his boots. Was this how it happened for him? Did he hear his daughter calling his name, her voice filled with pain and fear? The pounding stopped. A new sound began, a soft, pitiful whimpering. A child's cry. It was the same sound from the radio, but it was here, on the other side of my door. It was a confirmation. The thing from the radio, the thing the Ravens worked for, the thing that took Connolly. It was outside, and it had come for me. I pressed myself into the far corner of the room, making myself as small as possible, my eyes screwed shut. I recited the rules in my head like a prayer, a mantra against the madness. Do not investigate. Do not respond. Do not go outside. My logical mind, the communications technician, battled against the terrified son who wanted to throw open the door, and save his mother from the cold. The crying went on for what felt like an eternity. Then silence. A profound, heavy silence that was even more terrifying. The storm still raged, but the voice was gone. I stayed in that corner until the first gray light of dawn seeped through the window, my body trembling uncontrollably. When I finally found the courage to move, I crept to the window and wiped away the thick frost. On the ground below, the fresh snow was a perfect, undisturbed blanket. There were no footprints. Nothing. It had all been in my head, an auditory illusion. Then I saw it. On the outside of my window pane, etched into the frost, was a single, perfect handprint. It was long and slender, with fingers that ended in points like claws. It was not human. My last 2 weeks at Cape Lisburn were a waking nightmare. I did my duties. I ate in the mess hall. I spoke when spoken to. But I was no longer there. I was a ghost, just like the other men. When my replacement arrived, a fresh-faced young airman with eager eyes, I saw the same naive confidence I'd had a year ago. As I passed him in the walkway, I wanted to grab him, to warn him, to tell him the rules weren't a joke. But I just nodded the same way Henderson had nodded to me and kept walking. There was nothing to say. He had to learn for himself. As the prop plane lifted off the gravel runway, banking hard against the wind, I looked down at the station for the last time. The white radome on the peak, the skeletal white Alice antennas, the cluster of buildings huddled against the endless white. It looked like a forgotten outpost at the end of the world, a tiny scar on a pristine landscape. But I knew better. It was a cage. And I knew, with a certainty that would haunt me for the rest of my life, that even though I was leaving, a part of me would be trapped there forever. Its voice sometimes carried on the wind, calling for the next new arrival.
My name is Elias Thorne. This is not a confession, nor is it a plea for help. It is simply a record, an attempt to impose a logical sequence upon events that defy all logic. Before my life narrowed to the hum of fluorescent lights and the sterile scent of floor cleaner, I was a man who dealt in order. I was an archival researcher, a custodian of forgotten histories. My days spent in the quiet, dust-moated halls of a university library. My world was one of cataloged facts and verifiable sources. Then the world shifted. Funding was cut, positions were eliminated, and my meticulously ordered life collapsed into a chaotic spiral of mounting debt and dwindling prospects. Desperation is a corrosive acid. It eats away at pride, at caution, at reason itself. It was in this state that I found the online job listing. Night clerk needed for 23427 convenience store. Immediate start. Excellent compensation. The salary they offer was ludicrous, nearly double what a position of this nature should command. It was a glaring red flag, a siren's song luring ships onto the rocks, but my ship was already sinking. I sent my resume, expecting no reply. To my surprise, a man who introduced himself only as Mr. Henderson called me the next day. The interview, if one could call it that, was a brief, gruff affair conducted over the phone. He asked no questions about my work history or my qualifications. His only concerns were my willingness to work the graveyard shift, midnight to 600 a.m., and my ability to start immediately. I agreed. Good, he grunted. The keys in your first paycheck are in an envelope under the counter. The day shift girl, Sarah, will show you the basics. Don't be late. The line went dead. My first shift began under a moonless sky. The store, named simply Corner Stop, was an island of stark, artificial light in a sea of suburban darkness. It sat on a quiet, forgotten road at the edge of town. a place where the neat rows of houses gave way to unkempt fields and skeletal trees. Inside, the silence was profound, broken only by the low, oppressive hum of the refrigerators and the buzzing of the overhead lights. The place was unnervingly clean, almost sterile. Every can was perfectly aligned. Every candy bar sat in its designated slot. Every surface gleamed under the unforgiving glare. It felt less like a place of commerce and more like a museum exhibit designed to look like a store. Timeless and untouched. The isolation was absolute. In the first hour, not a single car passed by on the road outside. At 11:55 p.m., a young woman with tired eyes and a perpetually hunched posture unlocked the door and let me in. This was Sarah. Her handover was a masterclass in frantic efficiency. She pointed out the register, the stockroom, the public restroom. Her words were clipped, her movements jerky, as if she were spring-loaded and desperate to be released. She avoided my gaze, her eyes darting towards the clock on the wall. "It's easy," she said, her voice thin. "Just keep the place tidy. The real instructions, well, you'll find them." She paused, her hand on the door, and for the first time, she looked directly at me. The fear in her eyes was a raw, physical thing. "Just read the list, the one by the register. Follow it. Follow it exactly. Don't be a hero. Don't get clever." Before I could ask what she meant, she was gone. Her small sedan peeling out of the parking with a squeal of tires that sounded like a cry of relief. Alone in the humming silence, I felt a prickle of unease. I walked behind the counter and found it a single sheet of yellowed, brittle-looking paper protected by a grimy layer of lamination. It was tucked beneath the cash register, just as she'd implied. The title, typed in an old, slightly uneven font, was stark in its simplicity. "Rules for the Graveyard Shift." I pulled it out. My first thought was that it was a prank, an elaborate hazing ritual for the new employee. The rules were bizarre, a strange mix of the mundane and the utterly nonsensical. I read them over, a small, condescending smile on my face. Rule Instruction 1: all transactions must be completed in cash between 1200 a.m. and 500 a.m. The card reader is for day shift use only. 2 at exactly 3:15 a.m., brew a fresh pot of black coffee. Pour 1 cup and leave it on the far end of the counter. You will find exact payment for it by the door when you open at 1600 a.m. He does not like to be kept waiting. 3. Do not under any circumstances go into the walk-in freezer after 200 a.m. Stock it before then. If you hear knocking from outside, ignore it. It will stop. 4. A man in an old-fashioned, dark raincoat will sometimes come in, regardless of the weather. He will not be looking for anything. Do not speak to him or make eye contact. He is just browsing. He will leave on his own. 5. If you hear a child giggling in the candy aisle, do not go looking for them. Turn up the volume on the store radio for 5 minutes. The music calms them. 6. If the payphone on the outside wall rings, answer it. A voice will ask for a name you do not know. Tell them you have the wrong number and hang up immediately. Do not engage further. 7. The lights in household, cleaning and household, will sometimes flicker in a pattern 3 short, 3 long, 3 short. This is a signal. Lock the main door immediately and retreat to the back office. Do not come out for 10 minutes, even if you hear the front door chime. It is not a customer. 8. Clean any smudges or handprints off the glass doors as soon as you see them, especially the small ones. 9. Never use the staff restroom at the back. Use the public one. We cannot guarantee your safety in the other. 10. If a woman with eyes that are too far apart asks for a pack of Starlight brand cigarettes, tell her you are all out. We have never stocked this brand. She will be disappointed but will understand. Do not offer her a substitute. I scoffed. It was absurd. He does not like to be kept waiting. The music calms them. It was the work of a bored predecessor with a flair for the dramatic. I, a man of logic and reason, would not be taken in by such childish ghost stories. I tossed the list back under the register and set about my duties, determined to treat this job like any other. I swept the floors, restocked a few shelves, and settled in behind the counter with a thick history book I'd brought from home. The hours crawled by in perfect, uninterrupted silence. As 300 a.m. came and went, my mind briefly turned to Rule 82. The coffee. I was tired, and the thought of wasting a pot of perfectly good coffee on a ghost story seemed foolish. I dismissed it and returned to my reading, losing myself in the political intrigues of 17th century Europe. At 3:20 a.m., the atmosphere in the store changed. It was not a sudden event, but a gradual curdling of the air. A profound cold began to seep out from the corners of the room. A damp, cellar-like chill that had nothing to do with the thermostat. The low hum of the refrigerators deepened, the frequency dropping until it felt less like a sound and more like a vibration in my bones. A low, guttural growl that resonated in my chest. I looked up from my book, my heart suddenly hammering against my ribs. The neatly stacked bags of chips on the shelf across from me began to tremble. A soft, rustling sound that was utterly out of place in the stillness. Then I saw the shadow. It detached itself from the corner of my peripheral vision, a flicker of movement where none should be. When I tried to look directly at it, it was gone. But I was left with the distinct impression of something impossibly tall and thin, something that bent at angles a human body could not. The air grew thick, heavy with a palpable sense of malevolent disappointment. It was so suffocatingly present that I found it difficult to draw a full breath. Panic, cold and absolute, seized me. The Rule 82. He does not like to be kept waiting. My hands shook so violently that I could barely operate the coffee machine. I fumbled with the filter, spilled grounds on the counter, and nearly scalded myself with the hot water. The entire time, the low growl intensified, and the cold deepened until my teeth were chattering. Finally, the coffee was brewed. With a trembling hand, I poured a single cup of steaming, black liquid. I walked to the far end of the counter, my feet feeling like lead, and placed the mug down. The instant the ceramic touched the formica, the change was immediate. The oppressive cold receded as if a switch had been flipped. The guttural growl softened, rising in frequency until it was once again the familiar, innocuous hum of the refrigerators. The air cleared, losing its suffocating weight. The presence, the feeling of being watched with ancient and aggrieved eyes, vanished completely. I was left alone, drenched in a cold sweat, my body shaking with the aftershocks of a terror I could not begin to process. I stared at the cup of coffee, steam rising from it in the sterile light. It was not a prank. It was not a story. The rules were not suggestions or superstitions meant to spook the new guy. They were a set of operational procedures, a system of cause and effect governing interactions with forces that had no place in my ordered, rational world. I had failed to perform a simple task, and in doing so, I had breached a contract I didn't know I'd signed. The penalty had been immediate and terrifying. My role here was not merely to be a store clerk. I was a service provider, a functionary for a clientele that was not and had never been human. The true horror wasn't that the store was haunted. It was that the store was open for business, on a level I couldn't comprehend. I looked at the laminated list, which no longer seemed like a joke. It looked like the most important thing in the world. It looked like a survival manual, and I understood with a certainty that chilled me more than the supernatural cold had, that I was trapped. 6 weeks. 6 weeks have passed since that first night, and the man I was, the skeptical academic, the believer in a rational universe, is a ghost. In his place is a creature of ritual and vigilance. My life is now governed by that laminated list. It has become my scripture, my catechism of fear. My nights are a meticulous, nerve-shredding ballad of appeasement. Before 200 a.m., I stock the freezer, my hand checking the heavy latch 3, 4, 5 times. I keep the small, tinny radio behind the counter, tuned to a bland pop station, the volume knob always within arm's reach. I monitor the lights in aisle 4 with the intensity of an air traffic controller, watching for a plane to fall from the sky. The psychological erosion is the worst part. Sleep, when it comes during the day, is a shallow, unrestful affair, plagued by dreams of flickering lights and knocking from behind closed doors. Bright, cheerful world of sunlight feels alien, a reality to which I no longer belong. Conversations with the few people I still know feel trivial. Their concerns about traffic and weather impossibly distant from my nightly reality of appeasing unseen horrors. I have become a prisoner of the graveyard shift, isolated by a truth so outlandish that to speak would be to invite a diagnosis of insanity. So I remain silent, the fear coiling in my gut like a cold serpent. The customers from the list are no longer abstract concepts. They are regulars. The man in the raincoat was the first I encountered after the coffee incident. It was a clear, dry night, the stars sharp and cold in the sky, yet he entered as if walking out of a torrential downpour. His dark, old-fashioned raincoat was soaked, dripping small, dark puddles onto my immaculately clean floor. He moved with a slow, drifting gait, his head bowed so that his face was completely obscured by the shadow of his hat. Rule 5-4 screamed in my mind, "Do not speak to him or make eye contact." I grabbed a mop and began to vigorously clean a patch of already spotless linoleum near the register, my entire being focused on the task. His presence was a vacuum, sucking the warmth, and sound from the immediate vicinity. The hum of the refrigerators seemed to fade. The air grew still and heavy. He drifted down the chip aisle, then back up the canned goods aisle, never once reaching for a product. After an eternity that lasted perhaps 3 minutes, he turned and left as silently as he had arrived. The moment the door closed behind him, the ambient sound of the store rushed back in, and I could breathe again. A week later, I heard it. A faint, tinkling sound from the far side of the store. Jiggling. A child's laughter coming from the candy aisle. Every protective instinct, every fiber of my being, screamed at me to go and investigate. Was a child lost? Had someone left their kid behind? But Sarah's warning and the stark text of Rule 5 held me in place. Do not go looking for them. Turn up the volume on the store radio for 5 minutes. My hand trembled as I reached for the knob. I cranked the volume, and a saccharine pop song blared through the tiny speakers, the sound feeling profane and jarring in the otherwise silent store. I couldn't hear the giggling over the music, but I felt it. I felt a sense of being watched with a playful, yet deeply predatory curiosity. It was the feeling of a cat watching a mouse, amused by its scurrying, knowing it could pounce at any moment. After exactly 5 minutes, I turned the radio down. The feeling was gone. The payphone was perhaps the most jarring. It's an ancient, disconnected relic bolted to the outside wall, a fossil from a bygone era. Its shrill, piercing ring ripped through the quiet of the store one night, making me jolt so hard I knocked over a display of chewing gum. My heart hammered against my ribs. Rule Phase 6. Answer it. I walked to the door, my legs unsteady, and pushed it open. The ringing was deafeningly loud in the night air. I lifted the cold, heavy receiver to my ear. Hello, I managed, my voice a croak. Static hissed on the line, thick and oily. Through it, a voice spoke. It was distorted, ancient, like the grinding of stones. It asked for a name that sounded like a cough and a whisper. Azrael. My blood ran cold. I forced the words out, a mantra of survival. You have the wrong number. I slammed the receiver back into its cradle. As I did, I could have sworn I heard a faint, frustrated sigh from the earpiece. A sound that seemed to exist for a split second, after the connection should have been severed. These encounters became my new normal. But it was the woman who truly taught me the nature of my predicament. She arrived around 4:00 a.m. on a Tuesday. She was elegant, dressed in a simple but well-tailored dress, and she smiled pleasantly as the door chimed. But her face was wrong. Rule Fate 10 had been specific. A woman with eyes that are too far apart. It was a subtle distinction, but once you saw it, you couldn't unsee it. The geometry of her face was just slightly off, creating an uncanny valley effect that was deeply unsettling. She glided to the counter, her pleasant smile never wavering. Her voice was melodious, but with a strange, flat effect, as if she were reciting lines she had learned phonetically. "A pack of starlights, please," she said. My mind raced. I was exhausted, my brain fuzzy from hours of hyper-vigilance. The polite, automatic response of a service worker rose to my lips. "I'm sorry, we don't carry that brand. Can I get you something else?" perhaps Marlboros. The words were halfway out of my mouth when Rule Faten flashed in my mind's eye like a bolt of lightning. Do not offer her a substitute. I caught myself, biting my tongue so hard I tasted blood. The half-formed offer died in my throat. I swallowed, my throat suddenly dry as dust, and corrected my course. "I'm sorry," I said, my voice strained. "We're all out." For a single, terrifying second, her mask of pleasantry disintegrated. The smile vanished, and her mouth twisted downwards into a snarl of such profound, cosmic hatred that it felt like a physical blow. Her eyes, already unsettlingly wide set, seemed to darken into black, empty pits. In that moment, the illusion of a polite woman shattered, and I saw what was looking out from behind her face. Something ancient, something predatory, something that despised me and my entire species with a passion that could unmake stars. Then, just as quickly, the mask was back in place. The pleasant smile returned, though it didn't quite reach her eyes now. "Oh, what a shame," she said, her sweet voice a horrifying counterpoint to the fury I had just witnessed. She turned and glided out of the store. I collapsed against the counter, my legs giving out from under me. I had almost made a fatal error. I realized, then, that the rules were not just a simple list of do's and don'ts for my safety. They were a complex system of social etiquette, a diplomatic protocol for interacting with non-human intelligences. Offering a substitute was not just a mistake. It was a grievous insult, a breach of a code I could not comprehend. It might have been seen as an invitation to a different kind of transaction, or perhaps a display of ignorance worthy of annihilation. I was not a zookeeper. I was an ambassador, on the front lines of an invisible world, and my only diplomatic pouch was a single, laminated sheet of paper. Later that night, as the first hints of dawn were lightening the sky, I was cleaning under the counter, trying to keep my hands busy. My fingers brushed against something rough carved into the unfinished wood. Curious, I pulled out my phone and switched on the flashlight. There, gouged into the particle board, were a series of frantic, overlapping scratches. It was a name, JCUBW, and below it, a desperate, terrifying message. ITSINTHE RAFLETO. Hey Smillaspus Delok. Ralph Forza Delro Oak. My head snapped up. I stared at the convex security mirror. Mounted above the register, its dark, curved surface reflecting a distorted version of the silent store. Rule 24 had kept me safe from the man in the raincoat by teaching me to avoid his gaze. But it had never said anything about his reflection. Jacob's warning implied a horrifying addendum. A loophole in a rule I thought I understood. It suggested the list was incomplete. Or worse, that it could be wrong. I stared at the dark, silent screen, a new and terrible fear taking root in my soul, dreading the next time the man in the dripping coat would come in to browse. Jacob's desperate message, carved like a final testament into the wood, changed everything. The passive, reactive terror that had defined my existence for weeks began to curdle into something else, a cold, focused need to understand. Survival was no longer enough. If the rules were flawed or incomplete, then simply following them was a fool's game. I had to learn the logic of the system I was trapped within. My shift was no longer a sentence to be endured. It became a field research opportunity in a laboratory of the damned. I began keeping a journal, a small, black notebook I kept hidden in my locker. In it, I documented everything: timestamps, atmospheric changes, the precise nature of every anomalous event. I cross-referenced these occurrences with the 10 rules, searching for patterns, for connections, for the things Jacob might have seen that led to his frantic warning. My senses, already honed by fear, sharpened further. I began to notice the subtleties, the way the knocking from the freezer sometimes fell into a strange, syncopated rhythm, the way the static on the other end of the payphone line would sometimes resolve, for a fraction of a second, into what sounded like whispered conversations in a language I didn't know. I began to cautiously, carefully, probe the boundaries of my confinement. I never broke a rule, not after the coffee incident, but I tested their edges. I still refused to open the walk-in freezer after 200 a.m., but I started pressing my ear against the cold, vibrating steel door when the knocking began. It wasn't random. It was a code. I was sure of it, though one I couldn't decipher. Then one night, amidst the rhythmic thuds, I heard something new. A voice, a dry, faint whisper that seemed to come from inches away on the other side of the metal. It whispered my name. Elias. When the man in the raincoat next appeared, his dark form dripping on another clear night. I was ready, remembering Jacob's warning. I forced myself to ignore the man himself, busying my hands with wiping down the counter. But this time, my eyes were fixed on the black and white security monitor above my head. I positioned myself at an angle where I could watch his progress without turning my head. In the grainy feed, I saw his reflection move down ISO 3. He was just as I remembered, head down, funereal pace. But then, as he passed from the camera's view, his reflection did not. The figure on the screen stopped. It stood perfectly still for a moment, and then its head craned upwards at an unnatural angle, looking directly into the security camera, directly at me, and it smiled. It was a grin that stretched its face far beyond human limits, a wide, predatory slash filled with far, far too many teeth. A cold, liquid dread poured through my veins. Rule 24 had kept me safe from the entity in the coat, but it had left me utterly exposed to the thing that watched through its reflection. The true revelation, however, was yet to come. It arrived on a Thursday, heralded by the lights in ISO 4. They began to flicker in their familiar, dreaded pattern. 3 short flashes, 3 long, 3 short. As I had done half a dozen times before, I moved to the front door, my hand reaching for the deadbolt. But tonight, Jacob's ghost and the smiling reflection were fresh in my mind. Hiding was no longer enough. I needed to see. I locked the door and retreated to the back office as instructed. But instead of cowering in the corner and counting the seconds, I went to the small, grimy window that looked out onto the store floor. It had always been blocked by a stack of old inventory boxes. But earlier in my shift, driven by this new, desperate curiosity, I had moved them. Heart pounding, I peered through the dirty glass, the store looked wrong. The air was shimmering, distorted, like the heat haze rising from asphalt on a summer day. The familiar rows of products seemed to waver and bend at the edges. Through this strange distortion, I heard the front door chime, a sound that was impossible, as I had locked it myself. A figure stepped through the shimmering veil where the door was. It was not a customer. It was tall, impossibly thin, its limbs long and jointed like an insect's. It moved with a jerky, unnatural gait that was both fluid and broken. It paid no attention to me or the office. It moved with purpose directly to ISL 4, the source of the flickering signal. It did not browse the shelves of bleach and detergent. Instead, it reached out a long, multi-jointed arm and phased it directly into the shelf, its form passing through the plastic bottles as if they were smoke. When it pulled its arm back, it was no longer empty. It was holding a small, pulsating orb of what looked like captured night. A sphere of roiling, dark light that seemed to drink the fluorescence from the air around it. The creature held the orb up, inspecting it for a moment with a tilt of its featureless head. It seemed to nod in satisfaction. Then, it turned, walked back to the front of the store, and exited through the shimmering distortion. The door chimed again. The heat haze effect vanished, and the lights in ISL 4 returned to their steady, normal glow. I stumbled back from the window, the gasping for air. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. This store was not just a haunted way station. It was a place of business, a transactional hub, a supernatural black market. The flickering lights were not a warning of a random monster loose in the aisles. They were a service notification, a signal that a pickup was scheduled. My role in locking the door and hiding was not for my safety from the creature. It was to ensure that I did not witness or, worse, interfere with the transaction. The physical store, with its mundane products, was a facade, a cover for a different kind of inventory stored in the spaces between realities. The high pay wasn't danger money. It was hush money. It was payment for my complicity in a system I could not begin to fathom. The moment I understood the purpose of this place, the point of no return was crossed. The system, it seemed, knew that I knew. The phenomena in the store shifted, becoming more personal, more pointedly directed at me. The whispers from the freezer no longer just said my name. They began to repeat phrases I had muttered to myself under my breath earlier in the shift. The child's giggling from the candy aisle was one night replaced by a perfect, chilling imitation of my late mother's laugh, a sound I hadn't heard in a decade. The trap was closing. In a fit of desperate panic, I used my cell phone to call the number for Mr. Henderson. A recorded voice informed me that the number had been disconnected. I looked up the parent company listed on my pay stub, Henderson Holdings LLC. It didn't exist. I drove to the corporate address provided. It was an overgrown, empty lot between a laundromat and a pawn shop. There was no one to quit to. There was no escape. This wasn't a job you could leave. I was no longer just an employee. I was a component, a cog in the store's horrifying machinery. That night, as I stood defeated behind the counter, My eyes fell upon the laminated list. My blood turned to ice. At the bottom of the typed list, below Rule Fate 10, was a new line, written in what looked like fresh, black ink. The handwriting was a neat, sharp cursive. 11. Stop asking questions. We are listening. The night it all came to end began with a storm. It wasn't just a storm. It was a biblical deluge, a violent tantrum of nature that hammered against the store's plate glass windows and shook the building to its foundations. While cleaning out an old filing cabinet in the back office earlier that week, I had found a dusty logbook. In it, a brief entry from a year ago to the day, storm tonight. JW didn't show for his shift. Jacob. This was the anniversary of his disappearance. A cold sense of foreboding settled over me. The storm seemed to act as a catalyst, an accelerant for the store's malevolent energies. The fragile system of rules I had so carefully maintained began to break down. It started with the lights in ISIL 4, their SOS flicker struggling to be seen against the strobing flashes of lightning outside. As I was locking the front door, the payphone on the wall began to ring, its shrill cry barely audible over the thunder. Before I could even decide which rule to prioritize, I heard it. Faint giggling from the candy aisle, interwoven with the rhythmic, insistent knocking from the walk-in freezer. It was a chaotic symphony of my deepest fears. I was overwhelmed, a panicked juggler, trying to keep a dozen spinning plates from crashing down. I retreated to the office for the ISIL 4 protocol, my ears straining to hear the chime of the phantom customer over the ringing phone and the storm's fury. The 10 minutes felt like an hour. When I emerged, the phone had stopped ringing, but the knocking and giggling persisted. The entire store felt charged, vibrating with a hostile energy that was escalating toward some terrible crescendo. It was then that I found Jacob's final message. In a moment of sheer desperation, I broke one of my own unwritten rules and entered the forbidden staff restroom at the back, thinking I could splash water on my face. The place was cold, rank with the smell of mildew. And there, scratched into the porcelain back of the toilet cistern, was his last, desperate warning. THRE, ISON and more, HEMAKCOURC off, THEO off, TE sto om. As I read the words, the lights in the store flickered violently. They buzzed, dimmed, and then, with a final, pathetic pop, died. The emergency generator in the back, which I tested weekly, sputtered for a moment and then fell silent. I was plunged into absolute darkness, a blackness so complete it felt physical. The humming of the refrigerators, the buzzing of the lights, the knocking from the freezer, the giggling from the ISIL. It all ceased. The only sound was the roar of the storm outside. And then, a new sound began. Soft, polite, a gentle tap, tapping on the front glass door. My blood ran cold. I crept from the restroom, my hands outstretched in the suffocating dark, and peered toward the front of the store. Through the rain-streaked glass, illuminated only by a flash of lightning, I saw a silhouette. The tapping was joined by a voice, and my heart seized in my chest. It was Sarah, the day shift girl, Elias. "Oh God, Elias, let me in," she cried, her voice filled with convincing panic. My car broke down just up the road. The storm is getting worse, please. Jacob's warning echoed in my mind. He makes you write it yourself. This was it. The final exam. A scenario for which there was no rule on the list. I knew, with a certainty that transcended logic, that the person at the door was not Sarah. The entities were using my memories, my fears, my sliver of hope for human contact, as a weapon against me. I stayed frozen, my back pressed against a cold metal shelf. The pleading grew more desperate. Elias, please. I'm scared. Then the voice shifted, melting into a sound that broke my heart. It was my mother's voice. Ellie, honey, it's Mom. Open the door, baby. It's so cold out here. Tears streamed down my face. But I did not move. This was the test, the lock-in. The polite tapping escalated into furious pounding that shook the entire storefront, the glass groaning in its frame. The voices shifted again, becoming a chorus of everyone I had ever known, pleading, begging, and then, finally, turning to threats, snarling my name with a venom that was utterly inhuman. I retreated to the back office, huddled on the floor, and covered my ears, reciting the rules over and over like a prayer. Rule 1, team cash only. Rule 2, I've coffee at 3:15. Rule 30, ignore the knocking. I don't know how long I stayed there, lost in a fugue state of terror. But eventually, I noticed a change. The relentless pounding had ceased. The cacophony of voices had fallen silent. A thin, gray light was filtering through the grimy office window. Dawn. As the first rays of the rising sun pierced the clouds, the emergency lights in the store flickered on with a hum, casting a pale, sickly glow over everything. The storm had passed. Shaking, I forced myself to my feet and emerged from the office. The store was a wreck. Products were strewn across the aisles, knocked from their shelves by the violent vibrations. But on the counter, in a space that was perfectly clean and untouched, sat 3 items that had not been there before. A single, pristine sheet of blank paper, a simple, black fountain pen, and next to them, a small, tarnished silver locket. I walked towards it, a strange, hollow clarity replacing the terror. I understood. The ultimate role of the night clerk was not just to manage the store, but to chronicle it, to expand its scripture. When an employee survived a new, uncatalogued event, they were compelled to create a new rule for their successor, adding to the store's institutional, operational memory. Jacob had failed his test. He had failed to write his rule, and he had paid the price. I had survived. This was my reward. My promotion. I was no longer just following the rules. I was creating them. My hand was perfectly steady as I picked up the pen. The fear was gone, replaced by a grim sense of purpose. I knew what I had to write. 12. If the main power fails during a storm, and the emergency generator does not engage, this is a lock-in event. Do not approach the doors or windows. The voices you hear are not real. They are a test of your resolve. Barricade the door if necessary. Survive until dawn. Your reward for doing so will be waiting on the counter. I set the pen down. I picked up the silver locket. It felt cold in my hand. On a strange impulse, I took it to the inventory scanner. I held it under the red light, and the machine beeped. The small screen on the register lit up with green text. Item 27 and 34. Memento of a lost voice. Price NTA. I carefully slid the new, handwritten rule under the plastic lamination, placing it at the bottom of the list. Then I walked to the front of the store and began to methodically pick up the fallen items, restoring order. I looked at my own reflection in the dark security monitor above the register. For the first time, I did not feel fear. I felt a sense of ownership, a sense of belonging. The sun was rising, casting long shadows across the floor. In the distance, I heard the familiar rumble of Sarah's car pulling into the parking lot to begin the day's shift. My shift was over. I was tired, but it was a calm, settled exhaustion. I knew I would be back tonight, and the night after that, and every night for the foreseeable future. I was no longer a victim of this place. I was its custodian. I was the keeper of the rules. I was home. My name is Samuel Jones, but on the CB, I'm just Sam. I've been an owner-operator for 22 years, which is another way of saying I've spent more of my life on the move than standing still. My world is a 2.1-meter wide aluminum cab, my home a Peterbilt 589 sleeper, and my constant companion is the low, steady rumble of a 600-horsepower engine. She's not just a truck. She's my business, my house, and my fortress against the endless miles of asphalt. To an outsider, the inside of my rig might look cramped. But to me, it's a marvel of engineering and personal space. The driver's seat is an air ride throne, molded to my frame after 1,000,000 miles. The steering wheel is flanked by a constellation of gauges: tachometer, voltmeter, air pressure, oil pressure, each one a vital sign I monitor, with an instinct born of experience. The center console holds the radio, heater controls, and the all-important tractor and trailer brakes. Everything has its place. Everything has a function. Behind my seat is the sleeper, my sanctuary. It's not one of those massive custom jobs, but it's mine. There's a pulled-out desk where I do my logbook, the comic book, as some of the old-timers call it. A small microwave is bolted to a reinforced appliance shelf, and below it, a mini fridge keeps my food from spoiling. The bunk is a twin-sized memory foam mattress, separated from the cab by a thick blackout curtain that offers privacy and a shield against the world. In the various overhead compartments and wardrobe-style closets, I keep my clothes, my tools, and my life, all neatly organized. This order isn't just a preference, it's a necessity. Out here, on the big slab, your truck is the only thing you can truly control. But control is a funny thing. You spend so long on the road that the world outside the windshield starts to feel less real. It becomes a movie you're watching, a silent film of towns and cities scrolling past. The isolation is the heaviest cargo you carry. Days bleed into nights, and the monotony of the road can lull you into a state that drivers call highway hypnosis, where you're awake and steering, but your mind is somewhere else entirely. You're physically present but mentally adrift, floating in a space between destinations. It's a profound loneliness, a detachment that can wear on a man. You learn to live with it, to find comfort in the solitude. You have to. Because out here, the line between being alone and being lost is thinner than you think. The job came in on a Tuesday afternoon. It was a high-paying load, a hotshot run that needed to get from a warehouse in New Mexico to a distribution center in Utah fast. My dispatcher, my travel agent, as I call him, was vague on the details. The usual route up the interstate was closed due to a chemical spill. He said he sent me a new route, a stretch of state highway that cut through the desert, a line on the map I'd never driven. It's an old road, he'd said, but it'll get you there. I pulled my bobtail rig into a dusty, bleached truck stop just outside of Gallup to fuel up before hooking up to the trailer. That's where I met Elias. He was sitting alone in a booth, nursing a cup of coffee. He looked like 100 other drivers I'd seen over the years. Worn out, with the kind of deep, set wrinkles that come from squinting into the sun for decades. But there was something else about him. He looked haunted, his eyes holding a permanent look of exhaustion that had nothing to do with lack of sleep. He must have seen the route on my tablet because he got up and walked over. You're not thinking of running that road tonight, are you, Hand? He asked, his voice a dry rasp. Hand was old slang, a familiar term between drivers. Got a load that needs moving, I said, keeping it professional. He shook his head slowly, a grim finality in the gesture. Some roads you don't run, no matter the pay. That one, we used to have a name for it. Called it the Thin Highway. I raised an eyebrow. I'd heard my share of trucker urban legends, phantom trucks, vanishing hitchhikers, black dogs that served as omens. Every stretch of desolate highway in America seemed to have its own ghost story. A thin highway? I asked, a hint of amusement in my voice. That's right, he said, his eyes unfocused, looking at something far away. A place where the veil between this world and the other one gets worn down, stretched thin from all the miles and all the souls passing over it. A place where you can sometimes see through to the other side. His words echoed ancient Celtic folklore I'd vaguely heard about, tales of thin places where the worlds of the living and the dead were porous. It was a strange thing to hear from a man who smelled of diesel and stale coffee. He reached into his jacket pocket and pulled out a small, rectangular card. It was heavily laminated, the edges yellowed and worn, the surface stained with grease and coffee. He slid it across the table to me. You're going to run it anyway. I can see it in your eyes. You're like I was, he said. So you take this, and you follow it to the letter. These aren't suggestions, Sam. They're physics. The physics of that road. He turned and walked away without another word, leaving me with the card. I picked it up. It felt heavy, substantial. On it, printed in a simple, blocky font, was a list of rules. I read them, my initial amusement slowly curling into a knot of unease in my stomach. It felt like a prop from a bad horror movie. Yet the sincerity in the old man's haunted eyes had been undeniable. Table 1T. The rules of the thin highway. Rule 1T. Begin your run after sunset. End it before sunrise. The road is not for the day. Rule 21. Do not exceed 65 movts. They are faster than you. but they don't like a chase. Rule 30, between mile markers 42 and 78, do not use your mirrors. What you see behind you is not for you, and it doesn't like being seen. Rule 4, hey, you will hear voices on the CB radio, channel 19. Some will ask for help. Some will offer it. Do not respond. You are alone out here. Rule 50. If you see a single black dog sitting on the shoulder, slow down and dim your lights until it is gone. It is a warning. Heed it. Rule 6C. Do not stop for hitchhikers, no matter how they appear. They are not who they seem. Especially the girl in the white dress. Rule 7 say, if your headlights flicker and die, pull over immediately. Close your eyes and count to 100. Do not open them, no matter what you hear against the glass. Rule 80. You may see another truck pacing you. It will have no lights. Do not acknowledge it. It is not a good buddy. It is looking for an invitation. Rule 90. If you must stop, do not leave the cab. The air outside is not your air. Rule 10. Before you exit the highway at dawn, pat the dash and thank her for the safe passage. Gratitude is a form of payment. Rule 11. The road always needs a watcher. I stared at the list, a mix of the bizarrely specific and the ominously vague. It was a perfect distillation of the kind of spooky folklore that thrives in the isolation of the road. A collection of superstitions formalized into a rigid doctrine. I tucked the card into my shirt pocket, dismissing it as the ramblings of a man who'd spent too many years staring at the zipper on the highway. Still a part of me. The part that had felt the oppressive loneliness of 1,000 empty nights couldn't shake it completely. An hour later, trailer hooked and brakes checked. I pulled onto the highway as the sun dipped below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of bruised purple and orange. Rule 51, at least, was easy enough to follow. The road was empty. A 2-lane ribbon of asphalt stretching in the deepening twilight. The hum of my engine was the only sound for miles. I was about an hour in, the hypnotic riv the drive beginning to settle over me, when the CB crackled. It wasn't the usual chatter of Channel 19. It was a single voice, distorted by static, layered with a strange, clicking cadence that was almost insect-like. Breaker 1, 9, what's your 20, driver? My hand instinctively went to the mic. It was a standard request for my location, but the voice it was wrong. I thought of Rule Y4C. You are alone out here. My thumb hovered over the transmit button. The professional in me, the man who believed in courtesy on the airwaves, wanted to respond. But the memory of Elias's face and the strange weight of the card in my pocket held me back. I stayed silent. The voice repeated the question, closer this time, louder, before dissolving into a hiss of static. A cold prickle ran down my spine. It was just a coincidence, I told myself. A bad signal. I tried to shake it off, focusing on the road ahead, on the twin beams of my headlights, cutting a path through the oppressive dark. And then I saw it. Up ahead, sitting perfectly still on the gravel shoulder, was a dog. It was large, black as tar, and its head was cocked as if it were listening for something. It was exactly as described in Rule 55. My heart gave a hard thump against my ribs. I scoffed, a nervous, involuntary sound. It's just a dog. but my hands moved on their own. My right hand flicking the switch to dim my high beams, my foot easing off the accelerator. I slowed the rig down, my eyes locked on the shape. As I rolled past, it didn't move. It just sat there, a silent, black statue in the pale glow of my lights. I passed it and brought my speed back up. But the feeling of being watched was now a physical weight on my shoulders. I glanced at the rearview mirror, then stopped myself, my blood running cold as I remembered Rule Feint 3. My pragmatic, orderly world had just developed its first crack, and the night was still young. The encounter with the black dog left a residue of fear in the cab, a cold film clinging to the inside of the windows. I tried to rationalize it. It was a stray, nothing more. The CB call was a skip, a signal bouncing off the atmosphere from hundreds of miles away. But the explanations felt thin, flimsy excuses against a growing dread. The road itself was changing. The world outside my windshield, once just a monotonous blur, now felt charged with a strange potential. The darkness between my headlights wasn't just empty, it was waiting. This was the feeling Elias had tried to warn me about. The sensation of driving through a place where the rules of the world I knew were fraying at the edges. I passed a green sign with white, reflected letters. Mile 42. My stomach tightened. I remembered the laminated card in my pocket, the words of Rule Feint 3 now screaming in my mind. Between mile markers 42 and 78, do not use your mirrors. What you see behind you is not for you, and it doesn't like being seen. It was an absurd command. A trucker's mirrors are his eyes. The big West Coast mirrors on my doors and the convex spot mirrors below them are essential for safety, for knowing what's around my 53-foot trailer. Ignoring them felt like driving blindfolded. It went against every instinct, every year of training. Yet, the memory of the dog, sitting so unnaturally still, and the chillingly specific nature of the rule, held me captive. I forced my gaze forward, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles ached. The highway stretched on, a lonely ribbon of asphalt under a starless sky. The hum of the engine, usually a comfort, now seemed to amplify the silence. The isolation was a physical presence, a weight pressing in on me from all sides. It's in these moments that highway hypnosis can take hold, where the road lulls you into a trance. But I was hyper, aware, my senses on a razor's edge. Every flicker of a shadow, every gust of wind that rocked the cab, felt like a prelude to something terrible. That's when I sensed it. Not a sight or a sound, but a shift in the air, a change in pressure, a presence. I fought the urge to check my mirrors, my neck muscles cording with the strain. Instead, I risked a glance out my driver. Side window. A truck was pulling up alongside me in the opposite lane. It was a massive rig, a cab over model, old and scarred with rust. But that wasn't what made my blood run cold. It had no lights, no headlights, no marker lights, nothing. It was a black hole on wheels, a shape of absolute darkness, moving at a perfect 65 miles per hour, its engine making no sound. I could hear the roar of my own Peterbilt. Rule Height 80. You may see another truck pacing you. It will have no lights. Do not acknowledge it. It is not a good buddy. It is looking for an invitation. My heart hammered against my ribs like a trapped bird. This was no phantom. It was real, solid, and terrifyingly close. It stayed right there, just off my port side, a silent, menacing partner in this midnight drive. I could feel its proximity, a vibration in the air that had nothing to do with sound. I stared straight ahead, focusing on the zipper of the dashed lane divider, praying for it to go away. But it didn't. It just stayed there, pacing me. A ghost ship on a sea of asphalt. Who was driving it? I couldn't bring myself to turn my head fully to look. The thought of seeing an empty driver's seat, or worse, seeing something sitting there, was more than I could handle. This was a test. Acknowledge it, and you give it an invitation. An invitation for what? I didn't want to find out. Minutes stretched into an eternity. The silent truck remained, a constant, oppressive presence. The urge to look in my mirrors became a physical torment. It was a primal need to see what was behind me, to understand the full scope of the threat. Was it alone? Was it the only one? The rules said what was behind me wasn't for me, that it didn't like being seen. Was this silent rig a distraction meant to make me look? The psychological pressure was immense. My mind, starved of information, started to fill in the blanks with horrors of its own making. I was sweating, my shirt sticking to the back of the air ride seat. My focus began to splinter. The road ahead, the silent truck beside me, the rules churning in my head. It was too much. And then, I made a mistake. It wasn't a conscious decision. It was a flicker of weakness, a momentary lapse in discipline. My eyes, desperate for any information, darted to the passenger side mirror for a fraction of a second. It wasn't a reflection. It was a window. The mirror did not show the dark highway behind my trailer. It showed a different place entirely. A desolate, gray landscape stretched out under a bruised, twilight sky that held no sun or moon. The ground was barren, cracked earth, and in the distance, skeletal trees clawed at the horizon. It was a dead world, a place of profound and utter stillness. This was a thin place, and I was looking straight through the veil. But the most terrifying part wasn't the alien landscape. It was the reflection of my own cab. In the mirror world, my passenger seat was no longer empty. A girl was sitting there. She wore a simple, old-fashioned white dress, stark against the gloom of the cab's interior. Her hair was dark and hung limp around her face. I couldn't see her features clearly, but I didn't need to. I knew, with a certainty that froze the marrow in my bones, who she was. Rule Quain 6 do not stop for hitchhikers, especially the girl in the white dress. I hadn't stopped. I hadn't picked anyone up. But by looking in the mirror, by peering into a place I was forbidden to see, I had somehow invited her in. As this realization crashed over me, the girl in the reflection slowly turned her head. Her face was a pale oval, and where her eyes should have been, there were only dark, empty sockets. She looked directly at me, not at my reflection, but at me. I ripped my gaze away from the mirror. A strangled cry caught in my throat. I snapped my head to my right, to the real passenger seat beside me. It was empty, but the air was different. The cab, my fortress, my sanctuary, suddenly felt violated. A pocket of intense cold hung in the space where she had been in the reflection. A cold so deep it felt like it was leaching the heat from my skin. I risked a glance out the driver's side window. The silent, lightless truck was gone. It had vanished as suddenly as it had appeared. The road was empty again. But I was no longer alone. The feeling of being watched was no longer outside the truck. It was inside, a palpable presence in the seat next to me. I hadn't picked up a hitchhiker, but I had looked where I shouldn't have. I had broken a rule, and something had crossed over. The air thickened, heavy with the scent of damp earth and something else. Something like decay. I gripped the steering wheel, my knuckles white, my eyes locked on the road ahead. I still had miles to go until sunrise, and the worst part of the thin highway was now inside the cab with me. The cab, my fortress of steel and glass, had been breached. Not by a physical intruder, but by something far worse, a violation of space and sanity. The passenger seat beside me was empty, yet it was occupied. A pocket of unnatural radiated from the vinyl, a chilling aura that the truck's heater couldn't touch. It was a cold that felt ancient and predatory. I could feel her there, the girl from the mirror, a silent passenger whose presence was a constant, screaming pressure against my mind. The air was thick with the faint, cloying smell of wet soil and something vaguely metallic, like old blood. My sanctuary had become a cage, and I was locked inside with a ghost. I kept my eyes glued to the road, my knuckles white on the steering wheel. The temptation to glance at the passenger seat, to confirm the emptiness that my eyes could see, but my soul couldn't accept, was a physical itch. But I resisted. I had already broken one rule by looking in the mirror. I couldn't afford another lapse in discipline. The consequences, I now understood, were not just stories. They were real. The CB radio crackled again, shattering the tense silence. It wasn't the insect like clicking from before. This was a woman's voice, laced with panic and choked with sobs. "Mayday, mayday, is anyone out there? My car, it broke down. I can see your lights. Please, I have a child with me. He's sick. Please, you have to help us." The voice was distorted by static, but the raw terror in it was unmistakable. It was a sound that would make any decent person stop. My foot instinctively eased toward the brake. A woman and a sick child, stranded in this godforsaken wasteland. But then I heard it, underneath the sobs, a faint, discordant harmony. A second voice, whispering the same words in perfect, chilling unison. Rule way 4A. You will hear voices on the CB radio. Some will ask for help. Do not respond. You are alone out here. My blood turned to ice. It was a trap. A sophisticated, cruel trap designed to prey on the most basic human decency. I pressed my foot back down on the accelerator, the engine groaning as I pushed the speed back up to a steady 65. The woman's pleas grew more frantic, more desperate, her voice rising to a shriek that clawed at the inside of my skull. "Don't leave us! Please! He's not breathing! You're killing my baby! Mustar!" The word echoed in the cab, followed by a burst of static so loud it made the speakers pop. Then, silence. I was shaking, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The psychological assault was relentless. This road didn't just have ghosts, it had intelligence. It knew how to peel back a man's defenses, how to find the cracks in his resolve and pry them open. I drove on, the silence in the cab now heavier than ever, punctuated only by the low rumble of the engine and the frantic thumping of my own heart. The cold from the passenger seat seemed to intensify, and I could have sworn I heard a faint, dry rustle, like dead leaves skittering across pavement, coming from right beside me. I didn't look. I just drove. And then it happened. The powerful beams of my headlights, my only weapon against the oppressive, absolute darkness of the desert, began to flicker. Once, twice, my stomach plummeted. I stared at the dashboard, praying it was a loose wire, a failing alternator, anything but what I knew it was. But the lights flickered again, more violently this time, before dying completely, plunging me into a blackness so total it felt like I'd been swallowed. My rig was a ghost, blind and silent, hurtling through an abyss. Rule 5-7I: if your headlights flicker and die, pull over immediately. Close your eyes and count to 100. Do not open them, no matter what you hear against the glass. With trembling hands, I wrestled the big rig to a stop on the gravel shoulder. The moment the truck was still, the engine cut out on its own. The sudden, profound silence was more terrifying than any noise. There was no wind, no hum of electricity, nothing. Just the sound of my own blood roaring in my ears. I was a sitting duck. I took a deep, shuddering breath, squeezed my eyes shut, and began to count. 1, 2, 3. The cab was cold. The presence of the girl felt stronger now, amplified by the darkness and my own terror. I felt a cold breath on the back of my neck. 20. 120. 2. A soft tap came from the driver's side window, right next to my head. It was gentle, almost polite, like someone trying to get my attention. I squeezed my eyes tighter, my jaw clenched. 30. 5:36. The tapping stopped. It was replaced by a scratching sound. The slow, deliberate drag of fingernails across the glass. Scry-ape. Scry-ape. It was a sound designed to set every nerve on edge, to make the skin crawl. I could feel the vibrations through the headrest. 40, 7:40, 8:49. A man's voice whispered, his lips seemingly pressed right against the window. I know you're in there, Sam. Just want to talk. Open your eyes. How did it know my name? The thought sent a fresh wave of panic through me. I kept counting, my voice a hoarse whisper. 60, 1, 62. Then came the banging. Hard, frantic thumps against the metal of the door, the roof, the sleeper compartment. It sounded like a mob, dozens of fists hammering on my fortress, trying to beat their way in. The entire truck shook with the violence of the assault. And through it all, the whispers continued, a chorus of voices hissing from every direction. Let us in. It's cold out here. She invited us. My counting faltered. My mind was screaming at me to open my eyes, to face my attackers, to do something. But Elias's words echoed in my memory. These aren't suggestions. They're physics. Then, the worst thing of all. A whisper from inside the cab. It was the voice of a little girl, right beside my ear. They just want to see you. she breathed, her voice devoid of any warmth or emotion. The cold from the passenger seat enveloped me, seeping into my bones. I flinched away, pressing myself against the driver's door, as if I could phase through the metal. 91, 90, 293. My voice was barely audible, a desperate, broken prayer. The banging intensified. The truck, rocking violently on its suspension. I could hear the glass of the windshield, groaning under the pressure. 98, 99. I held my breath. 100. I finished the count and waited, my body rigid with terror. For a moment, the cacophony continued, and I thought the rule had failed, that I was about to be torn apart. Then, as if a switch had been flipped, it all stopped. The silence crashed back in, absolute and complete. I waited for what felt like an hour, though it was probably only a few seconds, before I dared to open my eyes. The cab was empty. The darkness outside was still perfect, impenetrable. I reached out a trembling hand and turned the key in the ignition. The engine roared to life, and with it, the headlights blazed back on, cutting a clean, sharp path through the night. The road ahead was empty. The shoulder was empty. There were no footprints in the dust, no marks on the truck. It was as if nothing had happened. But something had. I was no longer just a driver passing through a haunted place. I had paid a toll. I had let something in, and I had endured its test. The cold in the passenger seat remained, a permanent stain on my world. I put the truck in gear and pulled back onto the highway, my body soaked in a cold sweat, my mind fractured. A few miles later, a green sign glowed in my headlights, mile 78. The mirror zone was over. I was allowed to look again. But the thought of glancing into that polished rectangle of glass, of seeing what might be reflected in the seat beside me now, filled me with a horror so profound, it almost made me stop the truck again. I had survived the test, but the journey wasn't over. And I knew, with a chilling certainty, that the worst was yet to come. Passing mile marker 78 didn't bring the relief I had desperately craved. The acute, heart-pounding terror of the headlight failure and the assault on my cab had subsided. But it was replaced by something more insidious, a deep, soul-wearying dread. The immediate threats were gone, but the violation remained. The cold spot on the passenger seat was a permanent fixture, a cancer in the heart of my sanctuary. It was a constant reminder that I was no longer alone, that I had a passenger who had boarded without permission and paid no fare. I was now allowed to use my mirrors, but I couldn't bring myself to look. The memory of that gray, dead world and the girl with empty sockets for eyes was burned onto the inside of my eyelids. To look now felt like tempting fate, like asking the abyss to stare back. So I drove on, my eyes fixed forward. My world shrunk to the twin beams of my headlights and the suffocating confines of the cab. The miles rolled by in a blur of asphalt and oppressive darkness. The presence beside me was silent, but its silence was loud. It was the silence of the grave, heavy and absolute. I was a long-haul trucker, a profession defined by solitude. But this was a new kind of loneliness. The loneliness of being trapped with something that was not human a chilling intimacy with the unknown. The eastern sky began to bleed from black to a bruised, deep purple. Dawn was coming. Rule A1. End it before sunrise. A new kind of urgency gripped me. This wasn't about a delivery deadline anymore. It was about survival. The rising sun felt less like a promise of safety and more like a closing gate. I had to be off this road, out of this thin place, before the veil between worlds solidified, trapping me on the wrong side. My hands were slick with sweat on the wheel, my body running on pure adrenaline and the dregs of caffeine. I finally saw it in the distance. The faint, welcoming glow of highway lights, the familiar green of an interstate sign. The exit was just ahead. Freedom. As I guided the rig onto the off-ramp, the transition was jarring. The two-lane blacktop of the thin highway gave way to the smooth, wide expanse of the interstate. The oppressive silence was broken by the distant hum of other trucks, the sounds of the living world. It was like surfacing after being held underwater for too long. I took a gasping breath, the air in my lungs feeling sharp and real. Then I remembered the final rules. Rule Phaeton: before you exit the highway at dawn, pat the dash and thank her for the safe passage. Gratitude is a form of payment. My hand, trembling uncontrollably, reached out and patted the dashboard of my Peterbilt. The plastic was cool and solid beneath my palm. It was a real, tangible object in a world that had lost all sense of reality. Thank you, I whispered, my voice a dry crackle. Thank you for the safe passage. It was a trucker superstition, something the old-timers did, but this felt different. This was a ritual, a payment. As the words left my lips, the profound, unnatural cold that had been anchored to the passenger seat for hours simply dissolved. The oppressive weight in the cab lifted. The faint smell of damp earth vanished. I was alone again, truly alone. The relief was so sudden, so absolute, that it almost brought me to my knees. The girl was gone. I had paid the toll. I pulled into the first brightly lit, sterile-looking truck stop I saw, the rising sun casting long shadows across the parking lot. I killed the engine, and the silence that followed was my own. It was beautiful. For a long moment, I just sat there, basking in it. My mind a fractured mess of what I had just endured. I needed to get out. I needed to feel solid ground under my feet. I opened the door and stepped out of the cab, my legs unsteady. The morning air was cool and smelled of diesel fumes and dew, damp asphalt. The familiar, comforting smells of my world. I had survived. But as I stood there, a strange feeling washed over me. I remembered the last rule on the card, the one that had made no sense at the time. Rule Hair 11, the road always needs a watcher. I looked back at my truck, then at my own hands. They looked older, the skin more wrinkled, the knuckles more pronounced. I stumbled into the truck stop's restroom and stared at my reflection in the grimy mirror. The face that stared back was not the one I knew. It was gaunt, hollowed out. My eyes, once clear, were now shadowed, haunted, holding a permanent exhaustion that had nothing to do with a single sleepless night. They were Elias's eyes. The realization hit me with the force of a physical blow. The journey hadn't been a delivery run. It had been a test. An audition. A handover. Elias hadn't just been warning me. He had been choosing his replacement. He had seen the same stubborn pride in me that had once led him down that road, and he had passed the burden on. I splashed cold water on my face, but I couldn't wash away the image in the mirror. I was marked, changed. I had traveled through a liminal space, a threshold between worlds, and I had not come back whole. I had left a part of myself back on that highway, and I had brought a piece of it back with me. I walked out of the restroom and into the diner section of the truck stop, moving like a man in a dream. I ordered a coffee I didn't want and sat down in a booth, my mind reeling. I was free of the road, but the road was not free of me. That's when I saw him. A young driver, no older than 25, sat in a booth across the room. He was brimming with the kind of cocky confidence that only inexperience can give. He had a tablet out, tracing a route with his finger. A shortcut. I could see the name of the highway on his screen, a thin, forgotten line cutting through the desert. A cold, grim certainty settled over me. I knew what I had to do. The road always needs a watcher. It was a law of that place, its own kind of physics. A law I was now bound to enforce. I reached into my shirt pocket. The laminated card was still there, its edges worn, its surface stained. It felt heavier now, like a judgment. I stood up, my joints aching with a wariness that felt ancient, and walked over to the young driver's table. He looked up, annoyed at the interruption. I leaned in, and the voice that came out of my mouth was not my own. It was a dry, tired rasp, the voice of a ghost. You're not thinking of running that road tonight, are you? Hand. The cycle had begun again, and I was its new, unwilling gatekeeper.